Romantic Tales. Chapter 357. Yili shook her head. It's not a secret. It's just that it wouldn't be good if news of the battle between the two armies were to spread. You don't have to worry, I'm in good health. Moreover, I don't need to personally charge into battle. Han Mingxi glanced at her and said, if you still want to charge into battle, you'll scare Feng San to death. Mo Xiuyao had not only left Feng Zhiyao behind to assist Yili in battle, but more importantly, Feng Zhiyao could be said to be Mo Xiuyao's most trusted subordinate. The main reason for leaving him behind was to comfort Yili. Yili smiled and sighed softly. I hope this battle can end soon. Han Mingxi said, I can't help you much. If there's anything you need me to do, just say the word. Yili looked at him and smiled. I really do have something I need your help with. After saying this, she took out a file from the bookshelf behind her and handed it to Han Mingxi. You and Leng Hao Yu aren't here. Originally, I could only delay this plan. But now that you're here, you can take a look. Han Mingxi took the sealed file and flipped through it. He raised his head and said in a deep voice, Is it worth it for you to do so much for Mo Xiuyao? Yili smiled faintly. I'm the emperor's consort, so I'm bound to him for good or ill. How can it be considered as doing it for him? Han Mingxi's expression changed. After a while he sighed and said, I understand. I will take care of this matter. This is also good for the Han family, isn't it? Yili smiled faintly. It's been hard on you. I thought we were friends. Yili smiled. Yes, of course we are friends. At the beginning of October, Genom King of Gojoseon personally led 200,000 soldiers to attack Hangzhou. The Mahist army also fought with all their strength. It had been nearly 3 months since the start of the war in the northwest. This time it was a real fight to the death. It also made the West Hill soldiers understand that the soldiers of the Dechu state were not as weak and useless as they had imagined. The Mahist army that had protected the Dechu state for hundreds of years was still a bloodthirsty sword. Originally, the difference in manpower between the two armies was not too big. However, unlike the Xiling army which focused on attacking one place, the Mahist army had to defend the entire northwest. Therefore, the Xiling army still had the advantage in terms of numbers. Although the Xiling army was moving slowly, they still continued to move forward and gradually approached Hangzhou city. The originally peaceful Hangzhou city seemed to have become restless due to the impending storm. Many wealthy merchants and commoners brought their families and left Hangzhou city. The city was no longer as lively and peaceful as it used to be. Instead, it was a solemn and gloomy atmosphere before a great war. On the city tower, Yili leaned against the city wall and sat quietly. The warm, early winter sun shone on her light green cloak. It was so comfortable that it made one feel drowsy. Yili had a set of chess pieces placed in front of her. She held a black piece in one hand and slowly pondered. The surrounding soldiers who were guarding the city gate tower looked from afar and felt a sense of tranquility and stability. Han Mingyue stepped onto the city tower and looked at the woman leaning against the city wall in deep thought. He was speechless for a long time. Yili raised her head and smiled at him. Master Mingyue, is something the matter? Han Mingyue silently walked to her and sat down. He stared at the chessboard for a long time before asking, What do you plan to do? Yili raised her eyes and asked in confusion, What plan? Han Mingyue frowned and said, The 200,000 soldiers of Genom of Gojoseon are approaching Hangzhou. Don't tell me you don't know. Seeing Han Mingyue lose his composure, Yili smiled and said, Master Mingyue, don't worry. Even if Hangzhou city is breached, I will send someone to escort you and Miss Su out of here before that happens. Han Mingyue stared at her and said in a low voice, You have already predicted that Hangzhou city will be breached? Yili shook her head and said, No, Hangzhou city will not be breached. Hangzhou city is the last pass in the northwest of Dechu state. Behind it is the flat land of the Central Plains, and the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army that is currently fighting. Even if the 200,000 Mahist army in the northwest all die in battle, Hangzhou will not fall into the hands of the West Hill. Once Hangzhou was breached, it meant that they had left the backs of the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army in the past to the West Hill. The consequences would be unimaginable. Han Mingyue raised his eyebrows and looked at the quiet woman in front of him in confusion. Although he did not know much about the art of war, he was good at analyzing information and could understand some things. If you don't want Hangzhou to fall, why did you let the Xiling army continue to advance? Although the Mahist army has been wearing down the strength of the Xiling army, they have not really risked their lives. You don't have to hide it from me. Although the Tianyi Pavilion has not participated in the wars of other countries before, it does not mean that we have not studied it. The reason why the Mahist army was able to intimidate other countries was not only because of the prince who had ruled the country for generations, but also because of his excellent command of the army. The Mahist army's bravery and courage to advance without fear of death was more important. There were many historical records of the Mahist army's deeds. In order to defend an unimportant small city, they could all die in battle and would not retreat even half a step. In order to capture a pass, they could attack day and night. Even if there were piles of corpses under the city, they would not waver at all. The Mahist army today may be brave enough in the eyes of outsiders, but it was definitely not their true level. Yi Li casually threw down the chess piece in her hand and looked at the handsome man in front of her with a faint smile. Young Master Mingyu, are you worried about the Mahist army? Han Mingyue paused and said indifferently, Mingxi is my brother. I have to know if he can survive with the Prince Ding mansion. Clapping her hands, Yi Li stood up and said with a faint smile, Young Master Mingyu, you don't have to worry about this. I know what to do. Han Mingyue said coldly, I don't see what you know. The Mahist army clearly has the ability to block the Xiling army outside of Hangzhou. No. Yi Li shook her head and looked at Han Mingyue seriously. The Mahist army does have the ability to temporarily block the Xiling army. But it is only temporary. Young Master Ming, you should know that the Xiling army invading the Dechu state this time is only about 500,000. But the Xiling army is more than 1.5 million. The Xiling people are brave and can recruit soldiers at any time. They don't need much training and can recruit at least 1 million people in a short time. At that time, even if the Mahist army can fight against 10 people, they won't be able to resist so many people. And the Xiling people are not weak. In these days of battles, 2 of our people can at most exchange for 3 of their people. Han Mingyue frowned and said, if that's the case, won't you be inviting a wolf into the house by letting them into Hangzhou? Yi Li's smile was faint and cold, like the frost on the branches in the winter morning. Genom of Gojoseon won't send reinforcements to the northwest for a while. Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows. Now the whole world knows that the commander of the Northwest Mahist army is me, a woman who is not even 18 years old. If Genom of Gojoseon still wants to send reinforcements from the Xiling, even if he wins, his reputation will be completely destroyed. A Xiling war god who had fought for decades and a teenage girl who had never been on the battlefield. If Genom of Gojoseon still wanted to send reinforcements, it would be tantamount to admitting to the whole world that Lei Jinting was not only inferior to Mo Lufeng, but also to Mo Liufeng's daughter-in-law. From then on, the name of Genom of Gojoseon would become a laughing stock. Chapter 358. You plan to. The smile on Yi Li's face gradually faded. She tilted her head to look at the wilderness in the distance and said indifferently, I want the 200,000 soldiers of Xiling to stay in the northwest. Han Mingyue's heart shook. He could clearly hear the unconcealed killing intent and bloodthirst in Yi Li's words. You want the 200,000 soldiers of Xiling to stay in the northwest. How can you dare to think like this? For the first time in his life, Han Mingyue clearly felt his voice tremble. Wanting to annihilate the entire 200,000 Xiling army, these words, how could a woman who had never been on the battlefield say it? Oh, perhaps it was because she had never been on the battlefield that she could say such arrogant words. Yi Li leaned against the city wall and looked at him with a smile. Why wouldn't I dare? These days the Xiling army has been fighting for days. At most, no more than 100,000 have been able to reach Hangzhou city. This city will become the final place to bury them. Han Mingyue shuddered unconsciously, but a fiery feeling rose in her chest involuntarily. Looking steadily at Yi Li, Han Mingyue said, Now I finally understand why Xu likes you. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked at him with a smile. Han Mingyue said with some nostalgia, I still remember that year. When Xu first went to the battlefield, he was only 13 or 14 years old. He said that as long as he was given 3 or 4 years, he might be able to sweep through Nanzhou and bring peace to the south of Dechu state for 100 years. It's a pity. Hearing his words, Yi Li seemed to be in a good mood. She said with a smile, That's why I am Princess Ding, Genom of Gojoseon. After hiding for so long, this consort is also looking forward to this battle. Late at night in a certain commander's tent in the Mahist army camp, the candles were still quietly burning. Emo Shuyao sat behind his desk and looked at the booklet in his hand. His brows furrowed from time to time. Emo Jingqi's determination to destroy the Mahist army was not to be underestimated. These days, the 500,000 Mahist army had to face more than 800,000 enemies on the surface. Including the enemies in the dark, a conservative estimate was around 1 million. Even though Emo Shuyao was a genius at war, this situation still put a lot of pressure on him. Not only did they have to divide their forces to deal with the armies from Nanzhao, Xiling and the Li King, they also had to keep Emo Jingqi at bay. In less than a month, Emo Shuyao had actually lost a lot of weight compared to when he was sick. Prince Ajin, who had not been seen for a long time, appeared at the door. His young face was still as silent as usual. Emo Shuyao raised his head and asked, "Has the battle report from the northwest come?" Ajin nodded and handed the battle report he had just received to Emo Shuyao. No matter how late it was, the prince always insisted on reading the battle report from the northwest every day before he could rest. Ajin, who knew this, was used to immediately sending the news to the prince every day for him to look over. Emo Shuyao reached out to take the report. He lowered his head to look and couldn't help but frown. The news that the Mahist army had retreated all the way to Hangzhou made him frown deeply. This did not seem like something the Mahist army was used to doing. Also, the Xiling army was not powerful enough to make the Mahist army retreat at such a speed. Looking at the casualty figures on the battle report, Emo Shuyao rubbed his forehead. "Is this Li Li's idea? What are you thinking about, Li Li?" After thinking for a moment, Emo Shuyao raised his head and said, "Bring me all the battle reports from the past few days and the maps." Ajin was a little surprised to see his lord suddenly stand up with a change in expression. He hurriedly responded and hurriedly turned to get the things that Emo Shuyao wanted. Ajin moved quickly. Soon, the maps and battle reports that Emo Shuyao wanted were placed in front of him. Emo Shuyao carefully picked up each battle report and pondered over every word. He looked at the map from time to time and then fell into deep thought. "Prince," Ajin called out worriedly. The prince's complexion was not too good. Emo Shuyao lowered his eyes. His expression was bitter and helpless. "Li Li." Emo Shuyao looked at the map filled with markings in front of him and felt very conflicted. He understood Yi Li's plan and her intentions. But it was because of this that he felt exceptionally pained. His beloved wife, his Li Li, should have been the princess consort of Ding who was envied by everyone. But now she could only lead thousands of soldiers and horses in a bloody storm in a desolate place like the Northwest. All of this was because of his incompetence. Cut off the Xiling army and the Xiling border guards, pity. Wipe out 200,000 Xiling army. Li 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 Li. Emo Shuyao's heart suddenly seemed to be pulled by something. It was so painful that he could not breathe. Emo Shuyao's heart jumped when he finally calmed his churning thoughts. Li Li's plan may be good, but Xiling Genom of Gojoseon was not an ordinary person. If he saw through Li Li's plan. Suddenly standing up, Emo Shuyao said in a low voice, "Go prepare the horses. I need to go out. The generals will be in charge of the army for now." Ajin stilled and looked in confusion at Emo Shuyao. It was already the middle of the night. Why would the prince suddenly want to go out? Looking at the files and maps spread out on the table, perhaps something had happened to the princess consort? Ajin did not accept the order and said in a low voice, "Prince, it will be the 15th of the month soon. What if you're on the way? Furthermore, the war is urgent right now, so it's not appropriate for you to leave so suddenly." Emo Shuyao lowered his eyes and recalled that today was already the 13th of October. No matter what, it was impossible for him to reach Hong Province within 2 days. And the important matters in the army needed to be dealt with. After thinking for a while, Emo Shuyao quickly came back to his senses and said, "Tomorrow morning, inform all the generals above the rank of general to come see I. Also, inform Emo Hua to immediately take people to the northwest to protect the princess consort. If necessary, take the princess consort away from the battlefield at all costs. Set out immediately." "Yes, Prince," Ajin answered and left. Emo Shuyao weakly fell back into the chair and murmured in a low voice, "Li Li, you have to be safe. The war in the northwest seemed to have been suppressed for too long and finally exploded in an instant." After entering Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon quickly found that the Mahist army's attacks were getting fiercer and fiercer. The speed at which they wanted to advance was getting slower and slower. Looking at the distant Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon's gloomy face never saw a clear sky again. He knew that he had been tricked by Yi Li and lured to the northwest. But so what? Even if the Shilling army lost soldiers and generals, the Mahist army would not fare better than them. He did not believe that he would lose to a woman if they had the same number of soldiers. And time did not allow him to stop and wait for the reinforcements from the Shilling border to arrive. He had to take Hangzhou as quickly as possible and control the northwest to open a path for the incoming reinforcements. At the same time, he had to prepare to enter the Dechu state. Prince, most of the Mahist army has already retreated to Hangzhou. They should be prepared to defend Hangzhou to the death. Genom of Gojoseon raised his eyebrows and smiled. I thought that Yi Li had some great move. Defending Hangzhou to the death. Can she defend for 10 days or half a month? By the time our army arrives, how many days will she be able to endure in Hangzhou city? His subordinate advised, Prince, do not lower your guard. Yi Li used only 20,000 soldiers to defend Everlasting Forest at Shattered Snow Pass. She really cannot be underestimated. Genom of Gojoseon put away his smile and said calmly, I naturally will not underestimate Yi Li. Take Hangzhou as quickly as possible. Of course he would not underestimate her. He would use all his strength to take Hangzhou. Underestimating the enemy was not a mistake that people his age would make. Thinking of that seemingly graceful and elegant woman, he was really curious. When he took Hangzhou and stood in front of her, would she still be able to maintain her composure? Chapter 359. On the 13th of the 10th month, the Shilling army finally arrived at the city gates, and Hangzhou city was met with an unprecedented fierce attack. But at the same time, the Shilling army also met with a stubborn resistance that they had never faced before. On top of the city walls, the Black Cloud cavalry shot arrows at the invaders like rain, but the people below the city walls also charged forward without any regard for their own safety. Genom of Gojoseon rode his horse behind the Shilling army. He could vaguely see a woman in green sitting at the highest point of the city walls, calmly looking down at the battle below. Behind the woman in green, a few tall men stood with their hands behind their backs, also watching this battle. From afar, Genom of Gojoseon could still recognize that the handsome man in red was Prince Ding's trusted aide, Feng Jiao. Seeing his opponent sitting so leisurely on the high platform, Genom of Gojoseon's eyes revealed a murderous aura. He was so angry that he laughed. What a great imperial concubine. On the high platform, Yi Li also looked at a place behind the Shilling army from afar. She turned around and smiled at Feng Jiao. Feng-san, this is the first time we are fighting against Genom of Gojoseon face to face, right? Feng Jiao rolled his eyes in boredom. Isn't it? Before we were either playing tricks or retreating while fighting. If we continue to fight like this, people will start to suspect that our Mahist army only knows how to retreat. Hearing Feng Jiao's resentful complaints, Yi Li smiled and said, if that's the case then we should celebrate. After saying this, Yi Li turned around and took the pipa from Qin Feng's hands. She lightly played it and a clear melody flowed out from between her fingers. Yi Li smiled faintly, her 10 fingers nimbly dancing on the pipa. The sound of the pipa gradually grew louder and louder, gradually spreading throughout the entire battlefield. The soldiers who were fighting did not have the time to appreciate the majestic music. Even the slightest mistake on the battlefield could cost them their lives. However, that seemingly gloomy yet seemingly high-spirited voice clearly reached the ears of every soldier. The Mahist army's officers and soldiers seemed to recall the past glory of the Mahist army. It was as if they saw the heroic and domineering prince of the past leading them to charge and break through enemy lines. Expel the bandits and revive the spirit of our Mahist army. Not only did someone shout this, but the people on the battlefield immediately became murderous. Kill. Standing beside Yi Li, Feng Jiao's expression changed slightly as he said, "This is the song of King Yu breaking the battle formation?" Yi Li did not reply. Her 10 fingers flew swiftly as she played a string of majestic, murderous notes. Yi Li had been raised by the Su family and the Su family since she was a child. How could she not know music? She just didn't like it. This song of entering the battle formation was originally a Guqin song. It was majestic, simple and elegant with an ancient style. However, Yi Li felt that it was more suitable to be played by a pipa. Just like the ambush from her previous life, other instruments might be able to play it, but it would definitely be difficult to achieve the effect of a pipa. Apipa's fingering and range was very suitable for such an intense and majestic song. Feng Jiao clearly did not expect Yi Li to reply. He only said softly, "The song of King Yu breaking the battle formation has been lost for more than 200 years. Probably only the Su family would have such an ancient score." When two armies fought, it was said that the courageous would win. When the Mahist army soldiers were murderous because of their Wangfei, the West Hill soldiers were weaker in comparison. In the distance, the Xiling army's banner flew out. Genom of Gojoseon stared dazedly at the figure in green in the distance, his eyes bright. The general beside him whispered, "Prince, the Mahist army is in full swing. Why don't we avoid them first?" It had to be said that the Wangfei of Dingwa was indeed a talent. Just a piece of pipa music could raise the momentum of the entire Mahist army to a new level. Genom of Gojoseon looked up to the sky and laughed. He pointed the horsewhip in his hand to the highest point on the city wall and laughed loudly. "This kind of woman is interesting. Compared to her, all the beauties in the world are trash. Whoever dares to retreat will be killed. This woman. I must have her." The general beside him nodded and did not dare to persuade him again. Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, "I heard that Emo Shuyao is a genius in arranging troops. But I don't know if there is anyone in the Mahist army who can break the array now that Emo Shuyao is not in the army." Genom of Gojoseon obviously also recognized that the song just now was the song of King Yu breaking the array. The West Hill and Eastern Chu came from the same source 1,000 years ago. Although many of their cultures were different, they were similar. With a wave of his hand, the war drums sounded behind him. Several soldiers waved the red flags in their hands. Soon the West Hill soldiers' array began to change. Such changes could not be hidden from Yi Li and the others who were looking down from above. Feng Jiao frowned and looked at the changes below. He said, 6-flower array. But what's the difference? The West Hill soldiers below the city wall quickly formed a huge array that was circular on the inside and square on the outside. And this huge array was encased in countless small arrays. The Mahist army originally had fewer soldiers than the West Hill army. At this moment they were as small as the ocean in the array. Feng Jiao snorted and waved his hand. A green flag appeared above the city wall. The Mahist army's array also changed. A huge black dragon occupied the entire battlefield. The domineering and arrogant dragon head was the most elite black cloud cavalry of the Mahist army. Wherever it went, no one dared to go against its sharp edge. When the black dragon swung its tail, the enemy's array could only be in disarray and on the verge of collapse. Behind the Xiling army, a small black flag rose. The 6-flower array on the battlefield changed into a giant rock's sharp claws and quickly grabbed the black dragon's body. In an instant, the giant dragon was cut in two. "Damn it!" Feng Jiao cursed in a low voice. The flag on the city wall changed again. The giant dragon of the Mahist army immediately turned into countless black arrows and rushed towards the giant rock. Yi Li stood up and looked at the battle below the city wall. The so-called arrays of modern warfare had long been lost and were not really needed. So Yi Li was very unfamiliar with them. Although she had seen a lot of them in military books, she knew nothing about them in practice. At this moment, when she saw Feng Jiao commanding the army's array, she finally had some real ideas in her heart. At the same time, she lowered her head and thought of a way to break the array. Array formation was not a knowledge that could be mastered with just a little bit of knowledge. At the very least, it was very difficult for Yi Li, who was currently on the battlefield, to help Feng Jiao in this regard. Even if she could understand and come up with some ideas, she would definitely not be able to let the Mahist army under the city wall understand her intentions. Moreover, Yi Li was only a beginner in array formation. No matter what, she would not be so arrogant as to think that she could immediately go up and compete with Genom of Gojoseon, who was known as the war god of West Hill, to see who was better at array formations. Standing on a high place, Yi Li stared at the battlefield below without blinking. As expected, after a few changes in the array, the Mahist army's array gradually began to collapse and fall into the Xiling army's encirclement. "Princess." Qin Feng frowned and wanted to say something anxiously. He came from the Black Cloud Cavalry, but he was not the highest commander of the Black Cloud Cavalry. Cavalry also did not know much about arrays and were not proficient in them. But this did not stop him from seeing the fact that the Mahist army was gradually losing. Yi Li raised her hand to stop him from saying what he wanted to say. She lowered her head and thought for a moment before saying, Feng San is indeed not Lei Jinting's match. Let's end it here today. This battle seemed intense, but in reality neither side used their full strength. It was just a test. Qin Feng said, "Our army has already fallen into the West Hills array. I fear it will not be so easy to get out. Princess, does Princess have a way to break the array?" As if out of habit, Qin Feng looked hopefully at Yi Li. They had not followed Princess for long, but unconsciously, they all thought of Princess as an omnipotent genius. Yi Li shook her head and said with a smile, "I really do not know much about arrays." Chapter 360. Hearing this, Qin Feng was slightly dejected. No matter how powerful Wang Fei was, she was only in her teens. How could she know everything? Many generals might not be able to study it thoroughly even after spending decades. This time the ones remaining by Wang Fei's side were all young generals. The only experienced Marquis Nan had been sent out by Wang Fei to carry out other missions. Also, in Qin Feng's view, even if Marquis Nan was here, he would not be able to defeat Genom of Gojoseon. Yi Li rubbed her fingers thoughtfully and smiled faintly. Since technology and intelligence cannot solve the problem, then we can only solve it with violence. Qin Feng stilled and did not understand Yi Li's meaning. He saw Yi Li slowly walk down the high platform and walk to Feng Jiao, who was watching the battle from the city wall. Before Qin Feng could think, a bright red flame rose into the sky with a sharp howl. Then an earth-shattering sound of horse hooves sounded from the southwest. Like a black tornado, it swept through the entire battlefield. At the same time, the Mahist army that had been split up by the Shilling army connected in an extremely short amount of time. They broke out from the enemy's belly and formed an even larger formation with their comrades around them. Like a sharp arrow, they drew a crack in the Shilling army's enormous formation. The Black Cloud cavalry that had just arrived did not remember to kill or leave. They moved back and forth on the battlefield and immediately tore the neat formation into pieces. After the Shilling army where the middle army stood, the Shilling general looked at the sudden arrival of the Black Cloud cavalry and his expression changed. "What kind of formation is this?" Zhenan Wang withdrew the smile on his face. He thoughtfully looked at the distant city wall and said, "This isn't a formation. In front of absolute power, any formation was just empty talk." The Mahist army was slightly stronger than the Shilling army. What they lacked was military strength and truly skilled generals. If they wanted to compete with the Mahist army, they were prepared to pay the price. At this moment, with the addition of the Black Cloud cavalry, the outcome was hard to predict. The general beside him suggested, "Should we let the army at the back press forward and completely annihilate the Mo army outside the city?" The South Protecting King shook his head and said, "It's too late. They are about to retreat." As expected, the sound of retreating echoed from the walls of Hangzhou City. The gates of Hangzhou City were instantly opened. Under the cover of the Black Cloud cavalry, the Mahist army that had just charged out of the Shilling army's protection charged into the city. The Black Cloud cavalry behind them also charged into the city. What greeted the pursuing West Hill soldiers was a rain of arrows from the Mahist army guarding the city. Seeing this scene, the generals around Genom of Gojoseon began to curse one after another. "The Eastern Chu people are truly despicable. They can't beat us, so they run." Genom of Gojoseon was not angry, but instead laughed and said, "If they can't beat us, the most important thing is to run." However, Yi Li's actions made I understand one thing. In this Hangzhou city, there really isn't a general who can take on a big role. With just one Feng Jiao, after a few more years of training, he might be able to take charge. Right now he's too inexperienced. The generals thought, wasn't it so? The two sides had equal forces, but the Eastern Chu people needed the help of the Black Cloud cavalry to retreat into the city. If it wasn't because there was no one in the army, then what was? Mo Shuyao is fighting against 3 allied forces at the same time. No matter how strong Mo Shuyao is, he won't be able to do anything. I'm afraid that the Mahist army's generals have all followed Mo Shuyao into the pass. Isn't that so? Mo Shuyao actually handed the northwest to a woman. It can be seen that the Mahist army really has no one. While the generals were discussing, Genom of Gojoseon turned his gaze back to the light green figure on the walls of Hangzhou City. These days, the Mahist army's successive defeats and today's victory made the generals of West Hill look down on the Mahist army. However, as the commander, Genom of Gojoseon didn't. Not only that, it made him pay more attention to the young princess consort of Dingwa. These days it was true that they had won in a row, but they didn't get any real benefits in Hangzhou. Along the way, all the ripe grains in the northwest had already been harvested. Even the few that couldn't be harvested had been burned to the ground. These days the Mo family's army was said to be resisting, but it would be more accurate to say that they were obstructing them so that the people of Hangzhou could snatch the food. According to the information he received, Yili even sent the Mo family's army to help the people snatch the food. This invisibly increased his need to capture Hangzhou as soon as possible. In another month, the northwest would truly enter a severe winter. At that time, many places would be snowed and roads would be blocked. Even if there was grain, it might not be able to be transported over. On the other hand, it was impossible for their rations and military supplies to last until next spring. The closer they got to Hangzhou, the more Genom of Gojoseon had a hunch that the Mahist army deliberately led them to Hangzhou. But he couldn't understand the Mahist army or Yi Li's idea. Behind Hangzhou was the flat land of Guanyi. Judging from Yi Li's performance these days, it didn't seem like she had the strength to keep him out of Hangzhou city. The Mahist army didn't even have a master of strategy. In fact, Genom of Gojoseon didn't understand. He always thought that he valued Yi Li enough. But when he thought that there was no independent general in the Mahist army, it was already a kind of contempt. He also didn't think that Yi Li's goal wasn't to keep the Shilling army out of Hangzhou city, but to wipe out all 200,000 Shilling army in Hangzhou. Looking at the green-clothed woman on the city gate tower who seemed to nod at him, Genom of Gojoseon's heart suddenly skipped a beat. A strange sense of uneasiness instantly stunned his mind. But after repeatedly calculating, he still couldn't find the source of this uneasiness. After thinking for a while, Genom of Gojoseon turned around and returned to the camp. Quickly passed down the order. Order the 300,000 soldiers stationed at the border of Shilling to rush to Hangzhou as quickly as possible. The general following beside him was startled. He hesitated and said, "Prince, the speed of the army escorting the large amount of grain." The soldiers stationed at the border were carrying enough grain to last the entire winter for the 400,000 soldiers. If they wanted to transport it all the way to Hangzhou, their speed naturally wouldn't be fast. Genom of Gojoseon snorted softly and said, "It's fine as long as they can make it in time. If you are any slower, the army might have already arrived before you have taken Hangzhou city." The generals following him couldn't help but blush and show their dissatisfaction. If they couldn't even beat a woman, they wouldn't have the face to return to Shilling. "Within 5 days we will definitely take Hangzhou. I will wait and see." In Hangzhou city, Feng Jiao looked at Yi Li with a face full of sweat and said with a smile, "If Wang Fei hadn't made preparations today, the Mahist army that went out of the city to fight probably wouldn't have made it back. I'm still too lacking." Yi Li looked at him with a smile and said, "Even though you have been on the battlefield since you were young, you haven't fought in many years. In terms of experience compared to Genom of Gojoseon, who has been on the battlefield for half his life, you are naturally lacking. Today's lesson has taught us that it is best not to compare our weaknesses with other people's strengths." Feng Jiao helplessly spread out his hands and said, "In a face-to-face battle, the best thing to do is to arrange troops and formations. If we directly let the soldiers charge in groups, we will die even worse. But Wang Fei is right. We will only be at a disadvantage if we fight like this. If the two armies are equal in strength, what is tested is formations. If it was back in the south, Mo Jingli's motley crew, who would care about formations? They could just charge in and scare those shrimp soldiers to death." Chapter 361. Yi Li was also helpless. The most experienced soldier in the army, Marquis Nan, was sent out by her. As for the others, they were probably not as good as Feng Jiao, who had been learning from Mo Shiyao since he was young. Even though she understood some of the meaning, for someone who was more familiar with modern warfare, it was very difficult to understand the essence of these ancient formations. No matter how many books on the art of war one read, it was useless if one could not truly integrate into the battlefield. Not everyone who read the 36 stratagems of Sun Tzu's Art of War could become a famous general. Lowering her head to think, Yi Li said, "Try to avoid fighting face to face like this. How are the preparations for the matter I mentioned a few days ago?" Feng Jiao nodded and said, "Everything has been arranged according to Princess's wishes." "Prince?" After hesitating, Feng Jiao asked, "There is nothing important in Hangzhou right now. Will Princess consider entering the pass first? Entering the pass? Yili raised her eyebrows and turned to look at Feng Jiao behind her. His young and handsome face was filled with worry. Yili shook her head and said, I can't leave Hangzhou right now. If I'm not in Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon might be able to detect our intentions. I'm here to make him believe that the Mahist army will defend Hangzhou to the death. But, Feng Jiao said worriedly, if it was before I wouldn't be worried. Even if we were caught in a chaotic battle with Princess's abilities and Qi Lin, we would be able to escape safely. But now, if there is an accident. Although it could not be seen now, the princess consort was pregnant after all. The battlefield was constantly changing and no one knew what would happen. Yili said in a low voice, other than that, send someone to send Han Mingyue and Su Zuodi away. As for Qi Lin, I have other uses for it. Feng Jiao's face darkened. He stood firmly in front of Yili and said, Qi Lin will be used to protect Wang Fei. Yili raised her head and looked at him. She frowned and said, this consort didn't train Qi Lin to be a bodyguard. Without them, the plan this time would have failed. Feng San, think carefully about the consequences of the several 100,000 Xiling army entering the pass before speaking to this consort again. After she finished speaking, she no longer paid any attention to Feng Jiao. Yili turned around and walked down the tower. Feng Jiao sighed helplessly. How could he not know what Wang Fei was thinking? Not to mention the Xiling army's invasion of the Central Plains. Not to mention the damage to the Dechu state's territory caused by the Xiling army's invasion of the Central Plains. Just the threat of the Mahist army in the Guanyi Pass alone was enough for them to do their best to stop these bandits outside Hangzhou City. But, no matter what, they could not let anything happen to Wang Fei. Feng Jiao simply didn't dare to imagine what kind of reaction Mo Shuyao would have if something happened to the princess consort. General Feng? The subordinate following behind him reminded him in a low voice. Feng Jiao rubbed his brows and said, increase the number of bodyguards by Wang Fei's side by 2 times. They don't have to do anything. Once Hangzhou City is breached, immediately escort Wang Fei out of the city. Yes. At this time in the imperial city of Dechu State, the dazzling imperial palace was even colder and quieter than usual. In the imperial study, Mo Xuyao's expression was dark as he stared at the man kneeling on the ground. He said coldly, Mo Xuyao has turned to the Guanyi Pass and ordered Wang Fei to lead 200,000 soldiers to resist the Xiling Genom of Gojoseon. The man kneeling on the ground shuddered at the coldness in his voice. He said in a trembling voice, replying to your majesty, the news from the northwest is like this. Wang Fei led the Mahist army guarding the northwest and retreated to Hangzhou. I'm afraid she plans to have a decisive battle with the Xiling army near Hangzhou. Several generals near Hangzhou in the Guanyi Pass have submitted petitions to support Wang Fei. Shut up. Mo Jingqi said coldly. Because of his rapid breathing, his chest was heaving up and down. Supporting Ding Wang Fei. After winning this battle, would Ding Wang Fei gain the reputation of not losing out to men? After so many years, he had finally crippled Mo Shuyao. Who would have thought that not only did he stand up again, he even had a Wang Fei who could fight? Yili. Mo Jingqi regretted countless times in his heart. Why did he marry Yili to Mo Shuyao back then? Suddenly he thought of something. How is the situation of the Su family in Yunzhou? The kneeling official's heart tightened. He secretly glanced at the emperor and carefully said, the Su family. Old Master Qin Yun and Master Hong Yu are still teaching at Lishan Academy. There is nothing strange. His heart beat wildly. He suddenly had a feeling that the high and mighty emperor might have gone crazy. The Su family was the head of the world's scholars. If it was a peaceful time, it would be fine. But now, Dechu State was filled with internal and external troubles. The emperor actually wanted to make a move against the Su family. It had to be known. At least half of the world's officials were Master Qin Yun's students. Furthermore, the Su family had no evidence that the emperor could use against them. Mo Jingqi was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. We understand. You may leave. Your Majesty, the Guanyi Pass generals petitions for battle. Petitions for battle? Mo Jingqi's cold voice made one's heart turn cold. You may leave. We will deal with it. This official will leave. Inside the imperial study, Mo Jingqi sat on the high throne. His expression was dark and gloomy. After a long time he finally spoke. Tell Marquis Muyang to immediately enter the palace to see us. The servants in the imperial study knew that the emperor's mood was not good. They did not dare to say anything and quickly turned to leave. Marquis Muyang came quickly. In fact, ever since his only beloved son followed consort Ding to the battlefield, he had not been at ease. Even the news of the Marquis Nan manor, which had always been at odds with him, being raided and the Marquis Nan and his son dying an unnatural death did not make him feel at ease. The Marquis Muyang manor was absolutely loyal to the emperor. It was because of this that Muyang followed Princess Ding to the battlefield. Although he had received 2 letters from Muyang asking for his safety, what was the use? The northwest was thousands of miles away from the capital. If something really happened by the time the emperor sent people over, his son's corpse would have rotted away. More importantly, Marquis Muyang understood the young emperor's personality very well. His paranoia was rare in the world. These days Muyang did not report any news that was unfavorable to the Prince Ding mansion. This was definitely not in line with the emperor's original intention. At that time the emperor might even suspect that Muyang was colluding with the Prince Ding mansion. At that time, the Marquis Nan manor would be the example of the Marquis Muyang manor. Therefore, after receiving the news from the servants, Marquis Muyang only tidied up a little. He did not dare to delay and entered the palace to see the emperor. This official greets the emperor. Stepping into the imperial study, Marquis Muyang saw the emperor's gloomy expression. His heart trembled. He did not delay and knelt on the ground to greet him. He was obviously very satisfied with Marquis Muyang's respect. His gloomy expression eased a little. "My beloved official, you may rise." Mo Jingqi hated the fact that his officials had special rights and treatment. For example, the Ding mansion. He had cursed more than once in his heart for the decree that his ancestors had passed down to the previous generations of Prince Ding and Princess Ding not to kneel in front of the emperor. They were all his officials. Why did the Ding mansion's people not have to kneel? For example, there were old officials above the age of 70 who were given the grace of not having to kneel in the palace. However, none of the old officials, including Duke Hua, who had outstanding military achievements, had ever received this grace. Mo Jingqi enjoyed the feeling of all the servants kneeling in front of him. Chapter 362. Thank you, Your Majesty. May I know what instructions Your Majesty has for me? Marquis Muyang stood up and asked respectfully. Mo Jingqi did not say anything. Instead he stared at Marquis Muyang thoughtfully. Although Marquis Muyang was anxious and worried, he did not dare to show it on his face. Instead his expression became more and more respectful. After a long time he heard Mo Jingqi ask in a deep voice, "Have you received your son's letter of safety?" Marquis Muyang quickly replied, "Your Majesty, I have received it. The most recent one was half a month ago." "What did the letter say?" Mo Jingqi asked lightly. "My son only reported his safety and mentioned that Prince Ding had already rushed to Xinyang to join forces with Princess Ding. I think the reclaiming of the Northwest is just around the corner," Marquis Muyang said. Actually, how could Mo Jingqi not know what the letter said? Looking at the trembling Marquis Muyang, Mo Jingqi suddenly smiled and said, "Don't be nervous, Mu Qing. Muyang too only wrote 2 letters after such a long time. Aren't you afraid that your father will be worried at home? Do you know where Muyang is now?" Marquis Muyang said cautiously, I don't know. It's just that my son went to war with the army. He should be in front of Prince Ding's army right now." Mo Jingqi snorted, "That's right. Prince Ding is now leading 500,000 Mahist army and fighting against Nanzhao, Xiling and Prince Li's army. Your son is the vanguard." Marquis Muyang's heart skipped a beat. Looking at the emperor's face, he pretended to be shocked and asked, "Your Majesty, is that so? The Northwest outside the pass?" Mo Jingqi smiled. "Northwest?" The Northwest Princess Ding personally led 200,000 troops to fight against Genom of Gojoseon. Now, they have retreated to Hongzhou. Muqing, take a look at this. Mo Jingqi said as he pointed at a few memorials on the table. Marquis Muyang thanked the emperor and took a look at the memorials. It was a request for war from the various garrisons near the Northwest. Although there was a fierce battle going on inside the pass, the garrison troops all over the country had received orders to stay where they were and not to move rashly. As a result, the generals could only watch as Prince Ding fought with the allied army, unable to move. Although they didn't dare to say anything on the surface, Anyone with a bit of courage would inevitably be somewhat dissatisfied with this secret decree. Thus, it was not unexpected that these generals would request to come out of seclusion to assist Princess Ding. However, the emperor was clearly very dissatisfied with this. Marquis Muyang chose his words carefully and said, "Your Majesty, the generals are also patriotic. After all, the Northwest is a part of Dechu State and is your Majesty's territory. This is also their loyalty to your Majesty." Mo Jingqi didn't really doubt the loyalty of these generals. He looked at Marquis Muyang and said, "Mu Qing, who do you think is more suitable to lead the troops into battle?" This. Marquis Muyang clearly didn't expect the emperor to agree to the plan to assist Princess Ding so easily. For a moment he couldn't react and quickly said, "Naturally it is your Majesty's wise decision." Mo Jingqi stared at him and said, "Zhen wants someone absolutely trustworthy to handle this matter." For some reason Marquis Muyang suddenly felt that something was wrong. Under Mo Jingqi's gaze, he forced himself to maintain a calm expression and said with a smile, "There are many officials in the court who are loyal to your Majesty. Why would your Majesty worry about not having enough people? This humble subject is willing to lead the troops into battle." Mo Jingqi smiled with satisfaction and looked at Marquis Muyang. "That's good. My beloved subject won't be here tomorrow morning. You can quickly head to the northwest tonight. The troops from the 2 provinces closest to the northwest will be under your command." Marquis Muyang forced a smile and said, "Thank you, your Majesty. This subject will not disappoint your Majesty. I swear to expel the enemy and pacify the northwest." Mo Jingqi's eyes turned cold and said lightly, "Mu Qing's ambition is comforting. But Zhen still has one more thing to instruct my beloved subject." Marquis Muyang only felt his heart beat faster. His intuition told him that it was best not to listen to the emperor's next words. But the reality was that he could only stand in the hall more respectfully and said, "Please instruct me, your Majesty." The voice in the hall lowered. After a long time, an inconspicuous eunuch came out from the side hall. He carefully looked around and saw that there was no one around. He quickly turned and flew towards the empress's palace. No matter what happened elsewhere, the battle in Hongzhou was still ongoing. Genom of Gojoseon seemed to have finally lost his patience with the situation in front of him. He continued to attack every day and the night attacks became more and more intense. The small-scale attacks of the Mahist army could not stop the determination and footsteps of the Xiling army. What was comforting was that Mo Hua finally led the Shadow Guard to Hongzhou. This caused Feng Zhiyao, who had always been worried about Yi Li's Shadow Guard, to finally sigh in relief. Facing Genom of Gojoseon's increasingly fierce attacks, the destruction of Hongzhou city could be foreseen. "Wang Fei, please leave Hongzhou immediately." Mo Hua still had an expressionless expression as he looked seriously at the woman who was bent over the table and writing. But if one looked closely, one could see that there was a complicated gaze of admiration and worry in those eyes. In the past, Mo Hua had been dissatisfied and disapproving of Yi Li's intentions to change the Shadow Guard. Even though he had some understanding of her abilities, but that was it. But when he came to Hongzhou, he learned that this elegant and graceful woman who calmly guarded the northwest was pregnant. Mo Hua was finally convinced. This Princess Ding was definitely different from any other woman in the world. Because of this, he had to ensure the safety of Princess Ding. No matter if it was for the prince or the future Shitzi, or simply because he did not want to see anything happen to this extraordinary woman. Yi Li nodded and said, "I know. I will leave in 3 days." According to her calculations, Hongzhou city could at most hold on for 3 more days. 3 days later, the West Hill people would attack Hongzhou city. At the same time, it would also be the day they were completely destroyed. A trace of anger flashed through Yi Li's eyes. She calmly put down the brush in her hand. Mo Hua was silent for a moment before saying, "The Shadow Guard has people who are skilled in disguise. They can disguise themselves as Wang Fei and stay in Hongzhou." Yi Li helplessly shook her head and said, "Do you think this can escape the eyes of West Hill Genom of Gojoseon?" "Mo Hua, you don't have to worry. I will leave Hongzhou before then." Lowering her head, Yi Li gently stroked her still flat stomach. A trace of melancholy rose in her heart. No matter what, for the unborn child she could not put herself in danger. Even though she actually hoped to stay and defend Hongzhou city with the Mahist army. Seeing Yi Li stand up and turn to the bookshelf behind her, clearly having no intention of saying anything more, Mo Hua understood that she could not persuade her and could only helplessly retreat. On the road north from the Guanyi to Hangzhou, a few horses were quietly grazing in a forest. Beside a bonfire not far away, Mo Xuyao's handsome face was slightly dark. From time to time his handsome brows furrowed. Prince, a secret letter from the capital. Ajin walked over and hurriedly delivered a letter sealed with red wax. Mo Xuyao's eyes flashed. He took the letter and opened it. The contents of the letter caused his expression to change. Standing to the side, Ajin couldn't help but take a step back. He had been by the prince's side for more than a decade. In Ajin's memory, the prince's expression had never been so ugly. Prince. The capital. What happened in the capital? After a long time he heard Mo Xuyao grit his teeth and say, Mo Jingqi. Ajin's heart jumped. He was not an intelligent person and did not understand many of the twists and turns. But this did not prevent him from understanding that the relationship between the emperor and his prince was not as good as the common people thought. Had the emperor done something to provoke the prince? Chapter 363. Mo Xuyao slowly crumpled the letter in his hand into a ball. With a slight force, the ball of paper turned into powder and fell to the ground, turning into a thin layer of white dust. Mo Jingqi. You better pray that nothing happens to Li Li. Ajin, take Ai's token and head north. Order the Mahist army in the north to immediately reinforce Hangzhou. Ajin stilled and said in confusion, Prince, the north only has 50,000 soldiers right now. It is to defend against the northern militant. Mo Xuyao's lips curled into a cold smile. Mo Jingqi doesn't even care. Do you want I to care for him? Send the order, immediately reinforce Hangzhou. Ajin finally understood that Prince was serious. With a serious expression he said, Ajin understands. Ajin will leave. Taking the token that Mo Xuyao threw over, Ajin did not hesitate to turn and leave on his horse. Watching Ajin's departing figure, Mo Xuyao tightly clenched his fists. The words that slowly came out of his mouth made people's hearts turn cold. Mo Jingqi, you really think that Ai's patience is limitless? If anything happens to Li Li and Hangzhou, I will make you wish you were dead. Outside Hangzhou city, the sounds of fighting still filled the sky. However, the people in the city were no longer afraid of this. It was rare for Yi Li to sit leisurely in an empty tea house and drink tea. She pushed open the window and could see the soldiers on the city wall not far away from her. Zhuojing, Lin Han and the others stood silently by her side, looking at the city wall. Qin Feng, who usually stayed by her side, was nowhere to be seen. Mo Hua, who was responsible for protecting Yi Li, looked at the person in front of him with a conflicted expression. Wang Fei, I'm afraid that the north of the city won't be able to hold on. Wei Lin hurried over and said respectfully. Yi Li lowered her head and thought for a moment before asking, Is everything ready? Lin Han nodded and said, Princess, please don't worry, everything is ready. Princess, please leave Hangzhou as soon as possible. Yi Li said lightly, since everything has been arranged there is no need to rush. Zhuojing, your results? Zhuojing said in a low voice, although it hasn't been long, the people left in the city are all elites of the Mahist army. They are very effective. Princess, please rest assured. The word elite made Yi Li's expression change. After a while she sighed and said, That's right. They are all elites of the Mahist army. Lin Han looked at her and said, If we let the Xiling army pass through Hangzhou city, the Mahist army in the northwest will have no choice but to commit suicide as an apology. So, Princess Consort, you don't have to feel guilty. Yi Li tugged at the corners of her lips and smiled bitterly. No matter how noble the reason was, it couldn't cover up the fact that she wasn't good enough as a commander. If there was another general who was on par with Genom of Gojoseon, or if Genom of Gojoseon himself were in her position, he definitely wouldn't use her current method of fighting, to kill 1,000 enemies but to lose 800 of his own men. This was also because of the drawbacks and weaknesses of the Mahist army. There might be someone more suitable than her to lead the Mahist army, but the generals under her might not be convinced by these people. The tradition of only being loyal to Prince Ding created the current situation of the Mahist army. There were many generals who were good at fighting, but it was hard to find someone who could truly become a commander. This was also why the royal family was afraid of the Mahist army. In a country, the bravest and best fighting force was not the imperial army, but the private army of a certain family. After drinking the last mouthful of water in the cup, Yili stood up and took one last look at the Mahist army flag flying high on the city gate tower. She said, "Let's go." At noon on the 16th day of the 10th month, after 2 days and 2 nights of relentless attacks, Hangzhou City was conquered. This time, after conquering Hangzhou City, the Xiling army did not swarm in like they did in Xinjiang. Instead, they sent a small number of soldiers into the city to investigate. It was clear that they were afraid that the Dechu state would use the same trick again. In the Battle of Xinjiang, the number of soldiers who died in battle was far less than the number of soldiers who were burned to death or suffocated to death in the Great Fire. The soldiers who scouted the path first went through every street in the city. They quickly found that the streets were completely empty. Not to mention the Mahist army, there weren't even any commoners. After carefully inspecting the city and confirming that there were no problems, they sent someone out to report. Outside the city, Genom of Gojoseon listened to the soldier's report and frowned. "There's not a single person in the city?" The soldier replied, replying to Prince, "There's no one. Moreover, most of the buildings in Hangzhou City are made of stone. I'm afraid it's very difficult to catch fire. It's very unlikely that the Dongchu people will use the same trick again." Genom of Gojoseon's deeply furrowed brows did not relax. Of course, he was happy to conquer Hangzhou City, but the situation in front of him was clearly not normal. After the city was conquered, even if the original army had hurriedly retreated, there would still be a few defeated soldiers who couldn't escape in time. However, the situation in front of him proved one thing. The other side had already planned to retreat. Compared to the fierce resistance of the past few days, the empty city in front of him was even more strange. "Yili, what are you planning?" "Prince, shouldn't we enter the city first?" the general beside him asked. It wasn't easy to conquer Hangzhou City, but the prince was standing in front of the city gates in a daze. This made the soldiers very confused. After a moment of silence, Genom of Gojoseon said in a deep voice, "Immediately pass through Hangzhou City and pursue the remnants of the Mahist army. We can't stay in Hangzhou City. Prince, the reinforcements and supplies will take at least 10 days to arrive. Once we enter the pass, if something unexpected happens," the general in front of him carefully advised. When the army set out, the supplies came first. He didn't mention that they only had a mere 100,000 soldiers. Once they entered the pass, it might not even be enough to fill the gaps between the teeth of the Dechu state's soldiers. Their supplies could only last them for half a month at most. If they were too far away from the army escorting the supplies, if the supplies didn't arrive in time, the 100,000 soldiers would starve to death before the enemy even had to face them. Genom of Gojoseon frowned and said in a deep voice, "Enter the city." Soon the army poured in endlessly through the city gates. Genom of Gojoseon immediately stood outside the city. He stared at the towering city gates in front of him and felt that something was wrong. The soldiers beside him didn't dare to say anything even though the prince was in a bad mood. Seeing that more than half of the army had entered the city, there was a sudden commotion in the city. Genom of Gojoseon's heart sank. He said in a stern voice, "Something's wrong. Retreat from Hangzhou City immediately." But it was obviously too late. After a few earth-shattering noises, the city gates were filled with smoke and dust. When they could see clearly, the city gates that were originally wide open had disappeared without a trace. What they saw in front of them was gravel and mud that slowly blocked the entrance of the city gates. The city gates that were 2 people tall were only left with a gap that was less than half a person's height at the top. Looking at the half-collapsed city gate tower, it was obvious that someone had done something to the city gate tower. "Prince." The general beside him was pale. Almost 70,000 soldiers had already entered the city, and now there were less than 30,000 soldiers left. Everything in front of them. How did it happen? It seemed to prove the saying that blessings don't come in pairs and misfortunes don't come alone. Just as the deafening battle cries sounded in the city, several black whirlwinds came from the southwest and northwest, sweeping towards the chaotic West Hill soldiers in front of the city gates. Chapter 364. At this moment, blood flowed like a river in the city. All the buildings in Hangzhou were made of stacked stones, forming alleys of varying depths. When the Mahist army suddenly appeared on the streets and messed up the troops, countless soldiers in black appeared on the roofs on both sides of the streets with bows and arrows. No one could not recognize them. They were the most elite Black Cloud cavalry of the Mahist army. It was said that every soldier of the Black Cloud cavalry was a 1 in 100 archer. The rain of arrows mercilessly poured down on the West Hill soldiers on the streets. This was not a battle but a one-sided massacre. The Black Cloud cavalry took the high ground and attacked first. Their archery skills were obviously better than the West Hill soldiers. The West Hill soldiers had no chance to fight back and were forced into the narrow alleys. However, what awaited them was not a good fate. They were either shot in the chest by arrows from the roofs, or their throats were slit by people who appeared out of nowhere. The empty Hangzhou city instantly became a purgatory on earth. Outside the city, Genom of Gojoseon's face alternated between green and white. Now that things had come to this, he finally understood what he felt was wrong about these days. They thought that they had chased the Mahist army back to Hangzhou, but who could tell him where the cavalry that appeared behind them came from? Yili had actually hidden a cavalry of nearly 30,000 people behind them without anyone noticing. And these days the people who were dizzy with victory did not even think about the strength of the Mahist army, which was once known as the leader of all countries. Among the countless black whirlwinds, the red figure at the front was particularly conspicuous. Feng Jiao sat on his horse like a red whirlwind sweeping past. Everywhere he went, the West Hill soldiers avoided him. His handsome face was full of wanton and carefree. After enduring for so many days, he could finally fight to his heart's content. In terms of military strategy, he was not as good as Genom of Gojoseon. In terms of military experience, he was not as good as Genom of Gojoseon. But so what? 30,000 cavalry against 30,000 infantry. In this flat land, there was no need for military strategy or strategy. It did not stop him from beating the West Hill people. Almost in a happy mood, Feng Jiao's spear slashed across the throats of several West Hill soldiers. He spurred his horse and swept past the king of Jinnan's army. From a distance he smiled and said, "Your Highness the King of Jinnan, our Wang Fei wants this humble one to greet the King of Jinnan on your behalf." This greeting was definitely a form of mockery. Genom of Gojoseon of Gojoseon of Gojoseon, Genom of Gojoseon of Princess of Gojoseon's mind. It's just that. I would like to know, after Princess Ding burned Xinyang and destroyed Hangzhou's city gate tower, when Ai's reinforcements arrive, how will she defend Hangzhou? Feng Jiao laughed loudly and said, "Thank you for your concern, Prince. But our consort has also said that all the soldiers of West Hill who enter the northwest will be killed without exception." Genom of Gojoseon snorted, "What a boastful tone. I am already exhausted from dealing with a mere 200,000 strong army. Yet you still dare to boast like this. I may lose soldiers and generals, but the Mahist army won't fare any better." Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and laughed. "Prince, do you think the Mahist army is afraid of you West Hill people?" The princess consort was only worried about His Highness Genom of Gojoseon. The 300,000 reinforcements did not have Genom of Gojoseon with them. Whether or not they will come to Hangzhou is another matter. Genom of Gojoseon's expression changed slightly, but his face remained calm. However, his heart was already in a perilous situation. He had lost this round. Even though he had not seen the final outcome, Genom of Gojoseon understood that he had lost to Mo Lufang in the first half of his life, but he had not expected to lose to a woman in the second half of his life. Even though he had seen the outcome in front of him, he could not accept it wholeheartedly. After a few exchanges, he already knew in his heart that Yili was not some kind of world-shaking genius. It was because of this that he could not understand how the outcome in front of him had come about. After a long time, Genom of Gojoseon looked at the laughing red-clothed figure and said with a ferocious expression, "Order the gold-robed guards to capture Yili at all costs. Prince now here, kill." The reason Genom of Gojoseon fell for it was because he underestimated me too much. In a small valley about a dozen li away from Hangzhou city, Yili listened to the sounds of fighting that had not stopped in the direction of Hangzhou. She said to the confused Zhuojing and the others beside her, if his opponent was Xiao Yao, he definitely would not have fallen for such a trick. Zhuojing said, "Princesses, if Prince did this, Genom of Gojoseon would only think that it was a trick and change Princess, but he would not?" Yili smiled faintly and said, "No matter how careful Genom of Gojoseon thinks he is, but a man's natural contempt for a woman will not decrease. At most he will be a little less than others." Wei Lin smiled and said, "I believe that after this, Genom of Gojoseon will not underestimate Princess again." "Princess, After the battle outside the city ends, will they enter the city to help the brothers inside? Lin Han asked. Yili was silent for a long time and finally said, no, they will immediately go to help Marquis Nan. Everyone was silent. There were 70,000 Shilling army in the city, but only 10,000 Mahist army remained. No one could say how many would come out in the end. The 30,000 Black Cloud cavalry hidden outside the city, after killing the 30,000 Shilling soldiers, had to go to the border to help Marquis Nan. Marquis Nan and Marquis Nanshitsi Yun Ting, and a few other junior generals had to take 30,000 men to stop the 300,000 reinforcements from Shilling. No one could say how many would come back. It was not that Princess was ruthless. Everyone knew that they did not have that many soldiers. Princess had already made the best arrangements. Princess, it is time to leave. If we hurry, we can reach a small city to rest tonight. Yili turned her head to look at the city in the distance and nodded silently. Princess, there is a large group of soldiers heading towards Hangzhou. The shadow guard who was scouting ahead hurriedly came back to report. Yili paused. She frowned slightly and asked, who are they? The shadow guard said, they are the garrison troops from the neighboring Hangzhou. Why are they coming now? She knew that the generals from the neighboring garrisons had sent letters to the emperor to help Hangzhou. But these generals were all loyal to Emo Jingqi. She had sent people to ask for reinforcements, but without Emo Jingqi's decree, these generals were not willing or did not dare to lend her troops. They only promised that they had sent a letter to the capital asking for reinforcements. Yili understood Emo Jingqi's mentality and did not have much hope in this promise. Could they be the reinforcements for Hangzhou? Lin Han asked. Shuijing said coldly, the timing is too much of a coincidence. Princess, I will go and take a look. Yili frowned and said, go, but be careful. Shuijing was personally trained by Yili and was efficient in his work. He came back in less than 2 hours, but his expression was very ugly. Looking at Yili, Shuijing said, Princess, they are not here to help. Everyone was stunned. Mo Hua said coldly, could it be that they are here to help the West Hill people? Shuijing shook his head and said, they have set up camp a few miles away. I went in and eavesdropped on their conversation. He plans to stand by and watch. If we win, they will take advantage of the fact that we do not have time to rest to attack us. If the West Hill wins, we will act according to the situation and retreat to the camp. If both sides suffer, it will be better. They will take advantage of us. Chapter 365. What is that person in the palace thinking? Does he not want Hangzhou anymore? Lin Han asked in shock. Yili laughed coldly. He had already given the 3 provinces in the northwest to Xiling. Whether he wins or loses this battle, the northwest is no longer his. Naturally, it doesn't matter. What a lunatic. After a long time, Wei Lin finally spat out this sentence. How important was the northwest to Dechu state? Even someone like him who had no interest in military affairs knew this. In order to deal with the Ding King, Mo Jingqi actually gave up the northwest. Also, Shuijing's face darkened. The nearby garrisons have all received the emperor's secret edict. Take this opportunity to eliminate all the Mahist army in the northwest. Most importantly, capture the princess consort, dead or alive. The atmosphere instantly became heavy. After a long time, Mo Hua snorted with a dark expression. He said to Shuijing and the rest, protect the princess consort. After speaking, he turned to leave. Yili frowned, asking, where are you going? Mo Hua gritted his teeth and laughed sinisterly. I'll bring people to kill the generals leading the troops. Let's see how they can take advantage of the situation. Yili shook her head. No, there are so many troops stationed near Hangzhou. If there is no one to control them, it will only become more chaotic. Also, the ones leading the troops may not be the ones who have the final say. Mo Jingqi will definitely send someone over. Mo Jingqi was not someone who could easily trust his officials. Since he could give such a secret edict, he would definitely send someone with a high status. Mo Hua turned to look at Yili. Princess consort, what are your plans? Yili paused for a moment before saying softly, at least for today we can't let them near Hangzhou city. Shuijing, think of a way to let them know that I have already left Hangzhou. Everyone looked at Yili, their gazes filled with disapproval. Shuijing said, Princess consort, this is too dangerous. Yili sighed softly. We can only do this now. We can only hope that the prince will be able to send someone to take over Hangzhou in time. Go ahead. Jing stood where he was and refused to move even half a step. Li's expression darkened. This is an order. Jing had no choice but to turn around and leave. Hua was silent for a moment before saying, the prince should be on his way to Hangzhou. Wang Fei, if we take a shortcut to the south, maybe we can meet the prince on the way. Li turned her head to look at Hangzhou and said softly, that's the only way. Let's go. Just as Hua said, the group of people took a shortcut and headed south. Soon, the Dechu State's troops station not far away began to move. However, they didn't move in the direction of Hangzhou. Instead, they spread out as if they were looking for someone. At the same time, another group of elite troops quickly crossed the Hangzhou city and headed towards the Great Pass. Under the night sky, the sound of weapons colliding could be heard in the forest. In the forest, more than 10 shadow guards surrounded Li to protect her in the center. They calmly faced the enemies who continuously surrounded them. The ground around them was littered with corpses. The thick smell of blood filled the forest. Wang Fei, we've been surrounded. Hua stood beside Li and said in a low voice. Li nodded. It's obvious. Their group had less than 50 people while the enemy had at least 700 to 800 people. Moreover, after seeing the signal sent by the enemy earlier, she didn't doubt that more enemies were coming. Should I say that Mo Jingqi really values me enough? Lin Han said, I'm afraid that in their eyes Hangzhou will be destroyed sooner or later. Naturally, capturing Wang Fei is more important. Most importantly, they had heard from one of the captured generals that Mo Jingqi's secret edict mentioned that the person who captured Princess Ding would be rewarded 10,000 taels of gold and be promoted 3 levels. Killing Princess Ding would also give them 10,000 taels of gold. In comparison, the benefits of participating in the war in Hangzhou were negligible. Hua looked at the 4 of them and said, you guys protect Wang Fei and rush out. We'll block these people. Li smiled helplessly and said, it'll be difficult for just a few people to rush out. Let's go together. Hua paused. He understood that Wang Fei was telling the truth. Now that they were surrounded in the forest, if they wanted to rush out, they would be courting death. Moreover, Princess Ding was the target of these people's attention. Lowering her head, Li dodged a soldier's spear. Then she turned around and easily broke the other party's throat. The smell of blood in the air made her frown uncontrollably. She suppressed the urge to vomit in her heart. Princess Ding, please come out to talk. Suddenly, the enemy general's loud voice came from outside the forest. The surrounding attacking soldiers had clearly received the order and stopped. They only stared at them cautiously. Li stood behind the shadow guard. Her expression was calm as she calmly asked, which general are you? The other party chuckled and said, Wang Fei doesn't need to know. We have no intention of harming Wang Fei. We only ask that Wang Fei come out of the forest and immediately escort Wang Fei back to the capital to rest. Li smiled coldly. His words were really pleasant to hear. After returning to the capital, what awaited her was endless house arrest and exploitation. They were just using her to negotiate with Mo Xiuyao. Moreover, she was pregnant now. She definitely could not fall into Mo Jingqi's hands. Based on Mo Jingqi's hatred towards the Prince Ding mansion and his jealousy towards Mo Xiuyao, it was hard to imagine what he would do. Seeing that Li did not reply, the other party became impatient. In a low voice he said, Wang Fei, we also know that Prince Ding is currently leading troops here. Thus, we don't have much time to give Wang Fei. If Wang Fei does not come out in 2 hours, please forgive us for our rudeness. Wei Lin smiled coldly and said, since you know that Prince Ding is about to arrive, you still dare to be so rude to Wang Fei. Do you not want your little lives anymore? The other party was silent for a moment before saying, we have no choice but to share the wealth of the monarch. We hope that Princess Ding will be magnanimous enough to forgive us. After that, the atmosphere was tense as they waited. Li looked at the countless pairs of eyes staring at them from not far away. She gently stroked her flat stomach and smiled helplessly and tiredly. Jing, right now. I wonder what the situation in Hangzhou is like. Jing said, there weren't many soldiers who came first. I'm afraid that all of them were used to capture us. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the situation in Hangzhou shouldn't be too different from what Wang Fei had predicted. Li nodded with a gratified smile. That's good. Finally, one side has won. Lin Han asked in a low voice, Wang Fei, what should we do now? Yili calmly raised her eyes and said in a low voice, head to the southeast corner and rush out. Mo Hua's brows furrowed in worry. Wang Fei's body, Yili smiled coldly. If she falls into their hands, what do you think will happen? Mo Hua did not speak. Perhaps if a Princess Ding fell into Mo Jingqi's hands, she would not die or be used to threaten the prince. But if a Prince Ding mansion with a future heir fell into Mo Jingqi's hands, it would definitely be a disaster. Not only would it be a disaster for the prince's wife, it would be a disaster for the entire Mahist army. Mo Hua looked deeply at Yili and bowed to Yili with unprecedented respect. I will listen to Wang Fei's orders. The southeast corner led deep into the mountains. The terrain was more rugged and dangerous than other places. Perhaps because of this, there were fewer people guarding this side than the other sides. This was their only hope to rush out. With Yi Li's order, all the shadow guards rushed in that direction. Along the way they showed no mercy. Could be said that if God blocked them they would kill God. Buddha blocked them they would kill Buddha. Behind them there were also angry shouts from outside the forest. Kill them. No matter if they're dead or alive, don't let a single one escape. Chapter 366. Relying on this invincible momentum, the group actually managed to break out of the encirclement and headed deeper into the mountains. However, there were only 7 or 8 shadow guards left. Including Mo Hua, Zhuo Jing and the others, they were all riddled with injuries. Only Yi Li, who was protected in the middle, did not suffer any external injuries other than looking a little tired. There were few traces of people in the deep mountains and forests. Even if the enemy had thousands of people, it was not easy to find a few people hiding in such a vast forest. The next morning the group had already gotten rid of their pursuers. However, at the same time they were deep in the mountains and did not know where to go. They could only move in a general direction. Including her previous life, Yili had never been in such a difficult situation. Although she had experienced much worse conditions in her previous life, that was on the premise that her body was still very healthy. But now, because of her pregnancy, even if it did not affect her movements, her mental and physical strength were clearly not able to take it. The first 3 months of pregnancy was a dangerous period. It was not suitable for vigorous activities. Although it was only a day, Yili was still faintly uncomfortable. She was very clear in her heart that if she was not careful she could very likely lose her first baby. They found a relatively flat and hidden place to rest. The group ate some dry food and water. Lin Han said, as long as we don't meet any pursuers, we will be fine if we leave this place. Wei Lin shook his head and said, although we don't know the exact location, but from the position of this mountain, no matter which direction we go, we will be very far away from Prince and the Mahist army. And if we go back the way we came, we will very likely meet some pursuers. Yili thought for a while and said, Lin Han, you go back alone and find Prince. Lin Han disagreed and said, if we go back to ask for help, we only need to send a shadow guard. This subordinate will be able to help if I stay here. Yili shook his head and said, no, the way back will be very dangerous. I will only be at ease if you, Zhuo Jing or Wei Lin, go back. And now that we are deep in the mountains, as long as we are careful and hide, the chances of encountering a large group of pursuers is very small. Go quickly and come back quickly. If anything happens to the people on the way back, no one will know that we are here. When the time comes, Wei Lin patted Lin Han's shoulder and nodded. Lin Han glanced at everyone and could only nod. Yes, this subordinate will definitely find Prince as soon as possible. Yili nodded. Be careful on the road. After sending Lin Han off, everyone rested in this relatively flat area for a while. Yili was sitting under a big tree. She leaned against the trunk and looked up at the sky through the layers of shade. The corners of his lips lifted into a wry smile of self-mockery. How embarrassing, in this world. She knew that she was not strong enough. This was the era of cold weapons. Compared to those top experts, her inner strength was not strong enough, and her qinggong was not good enough. On the battlefield, compared to those truly exceptional generals, the military theories she had learned were of no use. She only relied on a completely different way of thinking from ordinary people. This time, in the confrontation with Genom of Gojoseon, she seemed to have the upper hand, but she knew in her heart that in a situation where the military forces and reserves were completely equal, it was very likely that she would be defeated in at most 3 months. She also understood that, In fact, she could have chosen to live in a more relaxed and comfortable way. As a woman, no one could say that she was wrong. But, in the end, she still could not completely see herself as a weak woman in this era. She watched men fight for their lives outside, while she enjoyed the extravagant food and clothing provided by them with a clear conscience. Even when she was in such a difficult situation, she did not regret it. At least, she had done what she could and did not stay in the capital and wait to be captured by Mo Jingqi and used as a chess piece to threaten the father of her child. Supporting herself against the tree, Yili stood up and walked to the fire on the side. The night of early winter was already very cold. The 3 shadow guards who were busy roasting meat and cooking soup saw Yili come over and quickly stood up. Yili waved her hand and said, "Everyone is tired. Don't be so polite. Sit down." The shadow guards had clearly never met such a master before. They looked hesitantly at Shuijing, who was sitting on a tree with his eyes closed. Mo Hua had taken people to go hunting. They could only seek the opinion of Shuijing, who was also a shadow guard. Sensing the shadow guard's gazes, Shuijing opened his eyes and glanced at them. He said, "We will listen to the princess's orders." Only then did the 3 of them sit down again. They continued with their work in silence. Compared to before, their expressions were much more reserved. Yili smiled faintly and reached for a branch to poke at the fire. She picked up a skewer of bird meat that had been roasted on the fire and threw it onto a tree branch. Wei Lin, who was hanging upside down on the tree, reached out and caught it. Without saying anything, he took a bite and ate it. Shuijing, who was on the tree on the other side, was drooling. "Princess consort." Yili raised her eyebrows and threw another skewer over. Shuijing cheered and ate happily. Yili turned back to look at the shadow guards, who had a shocked expression at their interaction. She smiled and said, "Everyone is hungry. Eat first. When Mo Hua and the others return, we will roast theirs." Shuijing bit into the roasted meat as he mumbled, "I said, when I go out to hunt, I will definitely be faster than Commander cough cough. Mo Hua." It seemed that because of the interaction between Yili, Shuijing and Wei Lin, the atmosphere gradually eased. Yili endured the smoke and grease from the fire and ate the roasted meat in her hand without any appetite. A shadow guard looked at her and took out 2 fist-sized red wild fruits to give to Yili. He said shyly, "I picked this on the way. If Princess does not mind, please eat this." Yili smiled and took it. She wiped it and took a bite. The slightly sour and sweet fruit made her feel much better. She nodded and smiled at the shadow guard. "Thank you." The shadow guard's face turned red and he hurriedly said he did not dare. As she ate the wild fruit, she looked at the shadow guards who were curiously examining her. Yili smiled faintly and asked softly, "I've implicated you this time. Are you afraid?" These shadow guards were all young and outstanding youths. If they were reorganized in the future, no matter if they were placed in the Black Cloud Cavalry Mahist Army or the Qilin, their future would be limitless. But this time almost all of them had been sacrificed with her. "Not afraid." The shadow guard who gave Yili the wild fruit said loudly, "It is the glory of the shadow guard to be able to die for the prince and princess consort." "Nonsense," Yili said softly. "You do not want to live first. Why do you want to die for loyalty? If you all die, who will not be loyal to the Wangfu?" The 3 youths looked in puzzlement at Yili. What Princess Consort said was clearly different from what they had been taught since they were young. They could not understand. Does Princess Consort mean that we should be afraid of death and flee at the last moment? Even though we are not the Black Cloud Cavalry or the Mahist army that is famous in the countries, we will not do such a thing. The 3 youths clearly did not agree with Yili's words. Yili said with a smile, "Death, there are those that are heavier than Mount Tai and those that are lighter than a goose feather. If you give up your life for a small matter or slit your throat because of a small setback, then even if you are loyal, it is foolish loyalty. If you have done everything you can for the greater good, for your ideals, for your beliefs, but can only sacrifice yourself in the end, then even if you die and lose, you are still a true warrior." The 3 youths were thoughtful. In reality, the shadow guard and people like them had an unwritten rule. For example, if they failed an important mission, many people would apologize with their lives. As shadow guard, they had seen many examples like this. They even had the same thoughts. Therefore, even though they were sad that they had to protect Princess Consort's brothers who had died, they were mentally prepared. If something happened to Princess Consort, they would all apologize with their lives. But hearing Princess Consort's words, it seemed that Princess Consort felt that their actions were not correct. Chapter 367. Wang Fei. If you made a mistake, shouldn't you use death to atone for it? Yili rolled her eyes at the sky and asked, if the person who made the mistake uses death to atone for it, does that mean that the mistake no longer exists? Then what should be done? Of course you should try to survive and atone for your mistake. Death is the action of a coward, Yili said firmly. The three youths thought for a long time before one of them carefully asked, Wang Fei, that, will Qilin still want people? Yili smiled, you also know about Qilin? The three nodded in unison. Qilin was not completely hidden in the Mahist army and King Ding's Fu. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of Mahist armies scattered all over the place, the Shadow Guard obviously knew more. The three youths looked at Zhuojing and Wei Lin, who were hanging upside down on a tree not far away, and their eyes were filled with envy and yearning. They were all from Fuji and some of them had even trained and grown up with them. But now they looked so different. Yili tilted her head and smiled. Of course, if you can return alive this time, I may be able to talk to Qin Feng and ask him to give you a chance. But, do you want to convince Mo Hua yourself? The three youths were overjoyed and their youthful faces flashed with vitality, sweeping away their previous fatigue and depression. Someone is coming. Zhuojing and Wei Lin jumped down from the tree at the same time and landed beside Yili with vigilant expressions. The other people also quickly stood up and prepared for battle. Yili listened and said in a deep voice, two groups of people. One group is going up the mountain and is still far from here. The other group is going up and coming down is Mo Hua's group. The shadow guard behind her had quickly extinguished the fire, and in a blink of an eye, Mo Hua had also brought a few shadow guards to the front. Mo Hua said with a heavy face, just now I saw someone coming up the mountain. Yili frowned and said, going down the mountain is definitely not possible. The foot of the mountain is completely surrounded. Is there a path up the mountain? Mo Hua said, there is a cliff at the top of the mountain and the mountain opposite the cliff is completely separated from here. If we can make it. Is it okay? Yili asked. Mo Hua nodded slightly. It's worth a try. Yili exhaled slightly and said in a deep voice, let's go up the mountain. The group walked up the mountain. Along the way, Yili noticed that a few shadow guards had left their group under Mo Hua's signal. Yili knew that they were trying to distract the pursuers that could catch up with them at any time. Glancing at the shadow guard who left silently, Yili didn't say anything. She just silently followed the shadow guard's footsteps up the mountain. The pursuers seemed to be coming very quickly. Not long after, the sound of a crowd and the sound of close combat could be heard from afar. However, the sound gradually faded away. It was obvious that someone had led them in the opposite direction. Mo Hua turned her head to look at the place where the sound was getting farther and farther away. She frowned and said, Wang Fei, the people coming up the mountain don't seem to be the pursuers of the imperial court. Yili nodded silently. That group of people had just been at the foot of the mountain. If they could catch up so quickly, they definitely weren't ordinary soldiers. It was obvious that the other party was an expert. They are Lei Zhenting's people. Zhuojing said, Zhennan Palace has a secret group of private guards called the Gold-Clothed Guards. There are about 1,000 of them. They usually guard Zhennan Palace. Every time Genin of Gojoseon goes on a campaign, they always accompany him. It was because of their existence that Genin of Gojoseon was able to escape death many times on the battlefield. This included when Genin of Gojoseon was defeated by the old prince. It was this group of gold-clothed guards that sacrificed almost all of their people to rescue him. The gold-clothed guards saved Genin of Gojoseon's life. Even though they were almost completely wiped out, Genin of Gojoseon rebuilt them afterwards. Yili asked as they walked up the mountain, the shadow guard doesn't seem to have received this news. Zhuojing said, ever since the gold-clothed guards were almost completely wiped out by the old prince when they tried to save Genin of Gojoseon, they haven't appeared in front of anyone. Almost everyone thinks that they don't exist anymore. This subordinate was told by Master Mingyu before he left. Yili was deep in thought as they walked through the forest. What about the gold-clothed guards and Qilin? Without much thought, Zhuojing replied, they can't compare. The gold-clothed guards only train in martial arts. They are only responsible for Genin of Gojoseon's safety and occasionally listen to Genin of Gojoseon's orders to deal with some people. Master Mingyu meant that their martial arts are not inferior to the shadow guards. Everyone's hearts were heavy. Even if 100 or 200 elite soldiers came at them, they might not be able to handle it. let alone the fact that they were not inferior to the shadow guards. As they walked, the group finally arrived at the edge of the cliff halfway up the mountain. Even though they were only halfway up the mountains in the northwest were not low. Moreover, it was the beginning of winter. Under the night sky, looking down the cliff, there was only a vast expanse of white clouds. Nothing could be seen below. Looking at the cliff in front of them, Yili turned her head and asked, "How far is it to the other side?" Mo Hua thought for a moment, then said, "About 15 or 16 zhang." Yili thought for a moment, then nodded and asked, "How is everyone's qigong? Can you cross?" Mo Hua nodded. Of the people present, there were only 2 shadow guards whose qigong was slightly weaker. The rest of them could cross. Yili said to the 2 shadow guards, "You two can go down the mountain together or separately. Be careful not to attract the attention of the pursuers. If the encirclement at the foot of the mountain is too tight, wait for a while." The 2 shadow guards were startled and looked at Yili helplessly. Yili sighed softly and said, "Hurry up and go. It's only 2 people. We'll be there soon. There's no point in you staying." Behind her, Mo Hua nodded silently. The 2 shadow guards bowed to Yili, then turned and left, quickly disappearing into the darkness. "All right, let's get ready to go. Mo Hua has studied the terrain before. You go first." Yili turned and said to Mo Hua. Mo Hua didn't delay. She tapped her feet and flew towards the cliff on the other side. When she landed, she could only see Mo Hua's blurry figure in the fog. Yili waved her hand to let the shadow guards go one by one. When it was Shuijing and Wei Lin's turn, neither of them moved first. Yili raised an eyebrow and said, "What do you want to do?" Shuijing said in a deep voice, "This subordinate and Wei Lin have seen Wang Fei's qigong. You can't cross." Yili stilled and then smiled helplessly. If she had known that this day would come, she would have trained her qigong even if she died of exhaustion. Her qigong could only be considered second-rate. Right now there was a faint feeling of discomfort coming from her abdomen. It was a dream to fly over by herself. Yili glanced at Shuijing and said, "Can you take me over?" Shuijing lowered his head and gritted his teeth, saying, "No." It required first-rate qigong to cross a 15 to 16 zhang cliff. To take a person over, it didn't just require qigong, it also required the support of great internal energy. Wei Lin smiled faintly and said, "This subordinate can't either, so we will stay and accompany Wang Fei." There was a faint noise coming from the distance. Yili swept an exasperated look over the 2 and said, "Nonsense. Are you going to die with me?" On the other side, a black shadow came through the air and landed on the ground. He looked at the 3 with a frown and said, "Why haven't you left?" His gaze paused on Yili's body. Mo Hua instantly remembered that Wang Fei had only practiced internal qigong for a little over a year. This kind of distance could not be crossed with qigong. This subordinate did not consider thoroughly. "Wang Fei, please forgive this subordinate. This subordinate will take Wang Fei over." Yili looked at him with a smile and asked, "How confident are you?" Mo Hua was silent. After a long time he said in a deep voice, 20%. If it was daytime, maybe he would be 20% confident. But now the sky was dark and there was a thick fog. At most he only had 20% confidence. Yili shook her head and said with a smile, "Then you mean that we have an 80% chance of falling off the cliff and not leaving behind a corpse? You go over first. I have my ways." How could Shuijing and the others be willing? Wei Lin said, "Then Wang Fei, please go over first. We don't need much time." Mo Hua frowned and said, "The pursuers are close. If they really are martial arts experts, if they find us, we won't be able to escape even if we go over." Chapter 368. The 3 were all stubborn. Yili could only say, "Mo Hua and Wei Lin will go first. Shuijing will stay." She took out the rope from the bag beside her and handed it to Wei Lin. Wei Lin silently took it and leaped into the thick fog on the other side. Shuijing watched as Yili fastened the rope to the tree by the cliff and asked, "Wang Fei?" Yili smiled helplessly and said, "Actually, I only have 50% confidence." The cliffs on both sides were clearly not giving them face. The cliffs on their side were slightly lower and the cliffs on the other side were slightly higher. This meant that Yili could not use the most energy-saving method to slide over. She had to pull on the rope and slowly move over. Because of the baby in her belly, she couldn't use any movements that were too dangerous. After fastening the rope, Yili was just about to move when an arrow shot out of the forest and passed by her. Very quickly, a group of men in black charged out of the forest and surrounded the two of them on the cliff. Princess Ding? We don't want to harm Wang Fei. Please come with us. The leader of the men in black stared at Yili, his eyes filled with malice and greed. Yili let go of the rope and calmly said, Shiling Genom of Gojoseon, the golden-robed guards? The man's eyes narrowed and he sneered, Wang Fei really knows a lot. Since Wang Fei already knows our identity, please don't make unnecessary resistance. If Wang Fei is harmed, we won't be able to answer to the prince. Yili raised an eyebrow and asked softly, What if I don't listen? The man sneered and said, The prince is in a bad mood because of what happened in Hangzhou. If something happens to Wang Fei, I think the prince won't blame us. Our prince is a hero of the age and he truly admires Princess Ding. Wang Fei, why do you want to follow that trash Mo Xiao? Our prince has said that if Wang Fei is willing to come back with us, he will give you the position of consort to Genom of Gojoseon. As for that cripple Mo Xiao. Whoosh, whoosh. Two air-piercing sounds were heard. 2 gusts of strong wind carrying a silver light shot towards the man, one high and one low, leaving a bloody wound on the man's face and neck. Yili coldly looked at the person in front of her and said in a cold voice, If you want to die, then this consort will help you. That person touched the wound on his neck and couldn't help sucking in a cold breath. Hearing Yili's cold words, he felt a chill in his heart and didn't dare to reply. Since the princess is so ignorant, don't blame us for being rude. The leader's face darkened and he waved his hand, Capture Princess Ding. The surrounding gold-clad guards swarmed forward. Zhuojing stood in front of Yili to block them. On the other side, Mo Hua, Wei Lin, and the others also understood the situation and returned to join the battle. The gold-clad guards were the elites that Han Mingyue had said could rival the Shadow Guard in battle. In a situation where one of them could fight against 10, the Shadow Guard had no way of fighting back. Yili looked at the Shadow Guard that had already been in the wrong. In an instant 2 more had fallen. Yili took a deep breath and shouted, Mo Hua, take the people and retreat. Mo Hua's hand did not stop. Her sword pierced through the chest of a gold-clad guard as she said, The Shadow Guard prioritizes the safety of the princess and cannot follow orders. Yili slit the throat of a gold-clad guard with one hand and retreated to a corner. Her other hand pressed against her throbbing abdomen as she said, Do you think there is any meaning now? Retreat. Mo Hua did not respond. Her actions became even more vicious, indicating that she was going to disobey orders. Yili felt her heart ache. Just as she was about to speak, a shadow flashed across the night sky and leapt in front of her. Yili raised her sword and swung it. The person moved to the side and grabbed Yili's arm, saying, It's me. Yili stilled, Han Mingyue, why are you here? Han Mingyue's appearance was slightly disheveled and did not have her previous elegant demeanor. She grabbed Yili and said, Quick, leave. Genom of Gojoseon has come. Seeing Han Mingyue, Zhuojing and Wei Lin were overjoyed. They tacitly separated the gold-clad guards in front of them and said, Young Master Han, take princess and leave first. Han Mingyue nodded. She grabbed Yili's arrowhead and was about to fly to the other side. Han Mingyue, you are very daring. A deep male voice filled with anger came from the forest. At the same time, a strong gust of wind attacked Han Mingyue. Han Mingyue was in midair and dodged the gust of wind with another person in tow. Her internal energy was stopped for a moment. Her originally flying figure could only land back on the ground. The white clothing on her shoulder had a tear and was dyed a faint red. Genom of Gojoseon walked out of the forest. Beside him was Su Zuidi, who had left Hangzhou with Han Mingyue. At this time her beautiful face was filled with pride and schadenfreude. She smiled as she stared at Yili. When Genom of Gojoseon arrived, the killing immediately stopped. Mo Hua and the others retreated in front of Yili and formed a semicircle to protect her behind them. Genom of Gojoseon looked at the pale-faced Yili standing behind the crowd. His eyes flashed with a complicated light. He then looked at the corpse on the ground and nodded in praise, as expected of the Prince Ding Mansion's Shadow Guard. Ai's gold-clad guards are still lacking. Zhuojing laughed coldly, Prince is too humble. The Prince Ding Mansion's Shadow Guard has many duties. How can they compare to the gold-clad guards? As soon as he spoke, he mocked Genom of Gojoseon for being a coward. Otherwise, why would he train thousands of people just to protect him? Genom of Gojosian was not angry. He looked at Yili and smiled. You are very good. You are completely out of Ai's expectations. As long as you come over, I can let bygones be bygones. Prince. Suzuki protested coquettishly, but she was frightened by Genom of Gojosian's cold gaze and swallowed her dissatisfaction. Yili looked at Genom of Gojosian, who was determined to win. She smiled and said, Prince is so fast. Yili admires you. Prince must have taken care of everything in and out of Hangzhou City. But Prince doesn't care about the hundreds of thousands of reinforcements at the northwest border? Genom of Gojosian's face darkened, but he quickly smiled and said, I am indeed worried about the reinforcements. But it is the first time in my life that I am under a woman's control. So, I think that you are more important. Moreover, I don't know why, but I suddenly feel that losing the princess is more painful for Prince Ding than losing the northwest. And if this Princess Ding becomes Ai's princess consort of Genom of Gojosian, it seemed that the more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was a wonderful idea. Genom of Gojosian could not help but look up to the sky and laugh. The gloominess that was still on his face because of the loss at Hangzhou City also disappeared without a trace. Suzuki, who was standing beside him, heard his words and her expression changed. She glared fiercely at Yili, but because of Genom of Gojosian's prestige, she did not dare to say a word. Yili sneered and said, I'm afraid that Prince is thinking too much. Genom of Gojosian said leisurely, whether or not Ai is thinking too much we will know soon. Shaoli, be a good girl and wait to become Ai's princess consort. Finally unable to bear the discomfort in her chest, Yili turned to the side and retched against a big tree. The cliff was suddenly silent. Genom of Gojosian's face was ashen as he stared at the girl who was vomiting while leaning against a big tree. Han Mingyue casually treated the wound on her arm and said with a smile, Prince, it seems that Princess Ding is not interested in becoming Genom of Gojosian's princess consort. Your Highness, why must you force me to do something against my will? Wei Lin sneered, some people are just a toad lusting after a swan's meat. Wishful thinking. None of the golden-robed guards dared to speak up. Princess Ding vomited when she insisted on becoming Genom of Gojosian's princess consort. It was clear that she really hated this suggestion to a certain extent. They also did not dare to speak. If they flattered her, it would not be good. Chapter 369. Genom of Gojosian's face was ashen. He snorted coldly and said, Do you think you can stall for time like this? Don't worry, I will let you go back with your lives. Tell Imo Xiuyao to come and attend Ai's concubine selection ceremony. Capture Princess Ding. The battle on the cliff began once again. Genom of Gojosian did not plan on watching from the side. Instead, he pounced towards Yili without hesitation. Zhuijing and Wei Lin tried to block him, but they were swept to the side in 2 or 3 moves. Han Mingyue and Mo Hua attacked Genom of Gojosian from the left and right. Although Genom of Gojosian only had one arm, his palm energy was like a knife. He had to use almost all of his strength to stop himself from being pushed back. Genom of Gojosian snorted and laughed, the so-called young heroes, you don't even have the strength of a teenager like Imo Xiuyao. You want to stop Ai? Go. He sent a palm towards Han Mingyue's chest. Han Mingyue was shocked and quickly flipped to the side to avoid the palm. She landed on the ground but was immediately surrounded by a few gold-robed guards. After dealing with Han Mingyue, Genom of Gojosian used the same method to avoid Mo Hua. From the time he attacked to when he arrived in front of Yili, it only took him 7 or 8 moves. In the face of absolute strength, any fancy moves were meaningless. Yili flipped the dagger in her hand and quickly stabbed towards Genom of Gojosian. The violent vomiting and the tiredness of the past few days not only made her face pale, but more importantly, she could clearly feel her strength draining away at a rapid rate. Genom of Gojosian moved to the side to avoid the attack. He was in a good mood as he exchanged a few moves with her. He grabbed her wrist and laughed, Your martial arts are not bad. It's a pity that your internal energy is a bit lacking. If you practiced martial arts from a young age, you could be ranked among the top experts in the world with your aptitude. But no. Wait. The person holding Yili's wrist paused for a moment. Genom of Gojosian's expression changed and he said sternly, What a Princess Ding. You are truly devoted to Imo Xiuyao. I will definitely make this vile spawn. Die bitch. Suzuki, who was not far away, looked at the scene in front of her with a twisted expression. She raised her hand to reveal the hidden weapon tied to her wrist and shot it at Yili. A cluster of silver needles rained down on Yili, and Han Mingyue, who was fighting with the gold-robed guards, paled. Drunken butterfly, don't. But it was too late. With a flash of silver, the hidden weapon left the box. Han Mingyue did not have time to think. She swept aside the gold-robed guards with her sword and leapt forward. At the same time, Genom of Gojoseon also heard Su Zuidi's voice. He turned his head to look. Yili took the opportunity to turn her wrist, and the dagger left a bloody mark on Genom of Gojoseon's hand. Genom of Gojoseon let go of Yili's hand in pain. Yili slipped and her body fell towards the edge of the cliff. Yili, princess. Genom of Gojoseon reacted quickly. He reached out to grab the edge of the cliff, but what welcomed him was Yili's faint smile and the cold glint of the dagger in her hand. The merciless dagger forced him to retract his hand faster than he could reach out. Genom of Gojoseon only had one arm. Letting go meant that he would not be able to grab Yili again. He looked dazedly at the falling woman's faint smile and her silent words. "You don't even think about hurting my child." A silver dagger shot up from the bottom of the cliff. Genom of Gojoseon's chest bloomed with blood. As if awakened by the sudden pain, Genom of Gojoseon lowered his head to look at the dagger in his chest. Because of the lack of strength, it did not really hurt his vitals. He raised his hand to grab the dagger in his chest. Yili, princess. Everyone was stunned by this sudden outcome. When Zhuojing reacted, he quickly rushed to the edge of the cliff. In the darkness of the night, he could only see the bottomless fog at the bottom of the cliff. In fact, at this moment almost all the Shadow Guard, including the Mo Huawei Lin, had rushed to the edge of the cliff. The empty cliff made everyone unable to recover their senses. Han Mingyue fell to the ground with a pale face. Her hand was already stained with blood. Su Zuidi's hidden weapon did not hit Yili or the Jinnan Wang who was standing beside her. Instead, she used her own body to block the cluster of hidden weapons that were not far away from them. Coughing softly, Han Mingyue wiped the blood from her lips. She looked at Su Zuidi, who was looking at her helplessly. Her eyes were filled with exhaustion and sadness. "Prince." Su Zuidi called out softly with some hesitation. Because she found that Genom of Gojoseon, who had pulled the dagger out of his chest, was looking at her with a gaze that she had never seen before. It wasn't anger or anything, but it made her feel inexplicably uneasy. Even she did not expect that Yili would fall off the cliff so easily. While she was overjoyed, she also felt a strange sense of unreality. At the same time, Zhuojing and the others were staring at her like poisonous snakes. She knew that at this moment, she had to follow Genom of Gojoseon closely. Otherwise, no one would be able to save her. "Prince, these people, should we?" A gold-robed guard at the side asked carefully. Genom of Gojoseon glanced at Zhuojing and the others. He said in a low voice, "No need. Leave immediately. Don't waste a moment." This time, although they had found Yili, they had not been able to capture her. Not only did they not have the bargaining chip they had expected, but they had also formed an unresolvable blood feud with Mo Xiuyao. Genom of Gojoseon knew that Mo Xiuyao was also rushing here. They had suffered heavy losses in Hongzhou. It would not be a good thing to face Mo Xiuyao at this time. With a wave of his hand, Genom of Gojoseon walked past Zhuojing and the others into the forest. Su Zuidi quickly grabbed his arm and looked at him pitifully. "Prince." Slap. A slap landed hard on Su Zuidi's beautiful face. Su Zuidi fell to the ground and rolled to the side due to the huge inertia. Genom of Gojoseon's cold and emotionless voice could be heard. "Imperial consort Qingrong Bai Long has suddenly fallen ill." After saying that, he walked into the forest without looking back. The gold-robed guards following behind Genom of Gojoseon did not dare to look at the beautiful woman who had fallen to the ground. Prince's meaning was very clear. He did not want to see this woman again. No matter how lustful they were, they did not dare to bring this woman along with them. "No." Su Zuidi shook her head frantically. She had never thought that this would be the result. And this kind of acceptance also foreshadowed the tragic fate that would befall her in the future. "But don't, Your Highness." Unfortunately, the gold-robed guards left just as quickly as they came. In just a short while they had completely disappeared into the forest. Zhuojing stood up and glanced coldly at the woman on the ground. He said in a cold voice, "Tie this bitch up and wait for Prince to deal with her." After saying that, he took back the rope that Yi Li had prepared to use to cross the cliff and threw it down the cliff. Wei Lin at the side also took out the rope that he carried with him and made the same preparations. Mo Hua looked at them silently and only spat out 2 words. Be careful. Zhuojing nodded and jumped down the cliff with Wei Lin while holding onto the rope. The bottom of the cliff was still silent, but the atmosphere on the cliff was so heavy that it made it hard for people to breathe. Han Mingyue did not care about his sorry state. He leaned tiredly against a tree and closed his eyes to rest. His white shoulder was covered in scarlet spots and his entire shoulder seemed to be numb. Although he had just taken the antidote found on Su Zuidi's body, he still did not have the strength to move his body. Su Zuidi was thrown to the side after her pressure points were sealed without any mercy. At this time she was crying miserably as she looked at Han Mingyue. Unfortunately, even if Han Mingyue had a trace of pity in his heart, he was powerless at this time. Mo Hua stood silently at the edge of the cliff. If not for his black hair fluttering in the wind, one would almost think that he was a statue and not a person. Chapter 370. An hour later, the foot of the mountain was once again in an uproar. Vaguely, countless torches could be seen surrounding this side. The imperial court soldiers are about to arrive. Supporting her heavily injured body, Han Mingyue stood up and leaned against the tree to look at Mo Hua. Mo Hua's expression turned cold, a mocking smile on his lips. So what if they come up? Wang Fei was not here. Their lives and deaths did not matter to the situation. But soon, another row of torches appeared at the foot of the mountain. Then they split into several fire dragons and moved up the mountain at an extremely fast speed. This was a movement that Mo Hua was familiar with. Mo Hua's lips moved and a bitter smile flashed across her lips. What was the use of coming now? Prince, you came too late. Soon there was the sound of weapons clashing at the foot of the mountain. Not long after, a dark shadow rushed out of the woods in the night and went straight to the edge of the cliff. He grabbed Han Mingyue, who was standing closest to him against a tree, and asked sternly, "Where is Junwei? Where did Junwei go?" Han Mingyue's lips moved but she could not speak. His gaze slowly moved to the edge of the forest. Mo Xiuyao quickly flew out of the forest. Before he landed, his gaze swept across the entire cliff and finally landed on Mo Hua. He asked in a deep voice, "Where is Wang Fei?" Mo Hua silently knelt on the ground. A long time later he said hoarsely, "This subordinate is useless. Wang Fei fell off the cliff." Mo Xiuyao's upright body swayed and a thread of blood appeared at the corner of his lips. His already pale and tired face became pale and green. He lowered his head and carelessly wiped the blood at the corner of his lips. But quickly more blood came out of his mouth. Mo Hua's expression changed dramatically. He did not care that he was kneeling and begging for forgiveness. He stood and went forward to support the other. Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and swept Mo Hua to the side. "Where did Zhuojing and Wei Lin go?" Mo Hua lowered his head and said, "They went down the cliff." Mo Xiuyao waved his hand, and the Mahist army that followed him out of the forest did not need him to say anything. They all took whatever rope they could find and went down the cliff. Mo Xiuyao looked at the injured people at the edge of the cliff, and his gaze paused on Han Mingyue for a moment. He walked to the edge of the cliff and before anyone could react he jumped down from the edge of the cliff, as if he had fallen into a boundless sea of clouds. When Feng Zhiyao appeared at the top of the cliff in a flustered and exasperated manner, his heart sank when he saw the scene in front of him. In the end he was still too late. He stared blankly at the slightly brighter horizon. The white horizon seemed to be dyed with a faint red color, giving rise to an ominous feeling from the bottom of his heart. In the boundless night sky, because dawn was about to arrive, the stars in the sky had gradually dimmed. Then a few stars flashed with a strange dark red light. Feng Zhiyao stood at the edge of the cliff with his hands behind his back. The 7 banes of the army destroyer were in the sky. The world was in chaos. It was not until noon of the second day that people gradually came up from the bottom of the cliff. But looking at the expressions of the people, Feng Zhiyao's originally not much hope seemed to be on the verge of collapse. When a dark red figure rushed up from the bottom of the cliff, everyone jumped in fright. Han Mingxi glared at the bottom of the cliff with a face full of hatred. Soon another person jumped up from below. When he landed he almost tripped and his body swayed a bit before he steadied himself. He coldly stared at Han Mingxi standing at the side and coldly said, Han Mingxi, you think I don't dare to kill you? Han Mingyue's heart went cold and she somewhat imperceptibly blocked in front of Han Mingxi. He understood the man in front of him far better than Han Mingxi. He didn't know what Emo Xiuyao had seen at the bottom of the cliff, but in just half a day Emo Xiuyao's aura had undergone a tremendous change. If the previous Emo Xiuyao was a treasured sword hidden in a sheath, then the current Emo Xiuyao was a bloodthirsty blade. Han Mingyue had seen Emo Xiuyao at almost every stage. When he was young he was heroic and radiant like a blazing sun. When he was young he was restrained, seemingly gentle and elegant, but in reality he was cold and indifferent. But the current Emo Xiuyao, even if he didn't do anything, was enough to make Han Mingyue tremble in fear. That pair of gentle and cold eyes carried a faint scarlet and unconcealed ruthlessness, as if he wanted to tear apart anything he saw at any time. Emo Xiuyao's thin figure was straighter than usual, but it was filled with a dangerous aura. It made him seem incomparably weak, but also as if he could make the world die with just a raise of his hand. Han Mingxi sneered and said, "Do you think this young master is afraid of you? Go ahead and kill. You, the country's stabilizing prince, are a peerless genius with unrivaled divine skills. When Jun Wei was guarding the northwest and facing off against Enchanting, what were you doing? When Jun Wei was being chased to the point where she had nowhere to go, what were you doing? When Jun Wei was pregnant and fell off the cliff, what were you doing? Emo Xiuyao, are you still a man? You trash." Pooh! Han Mingxi's words seemed to have broken through something that had been suppressed since last night. A mouthful of blood was spat out from Emo Xiuyao's mouth. Feng Zhiyao's doppelganger flew over. "Prince." Emo Xiuyao's face was as white as paper. But he did not fall down and just stared at Feng Zhiyao. Li is pregnant?" Feng Zhiyao's lips moved. There was a sharp pain in his throat and he could only nod with difficulty. Emo Xiuyao's expression was both happy and sad, but he could not seem to speak. The dark red blood seemed to be unable to stop flowing down his lips. Deep worry flashed through Feng Zhiyao's eyes. He said in a low voice, "Prince, take care of your body. Wang Fei. Wang Fei's great revenge." Feng Zhiyao did not say empty words like maybe Wang Fei would be fine. Something that even he himself did not believe could not convince Emo Xiuyao. And those people who had harmed Wang Fei. Feng Zhiyao sighed inside. Those people had to die. Otherwise, even Prince would not be able to live. On the edge of the cliff that was not very wide, everyone was silent and did not dare to speak. They were afraid that if they broke the silence, it would bring about an unstoppable and terrifying result. From yesterday until now the people on the cliff had not eaten or drunk, but now no one felt hungry or thirsty. Emo Xiuyao knelt on the ground and reported everything that had happened in the past 2 days in detail to Emo Xiuyao. At the same time the other people also learned of the situation at the bottom of the cliff. There was a raging river at the bottom of the cliff. After dawn the mist had dissipated, and there were no obstacles on the 2 sides of the cliff. In other words, Wang Fei Yili must have fallen into the river. Then the raging water made it impossible to predict where the person who had fallen into the water would be taken to. Feng Zhiyao stood and ordered his subordinates to take a large group of people to search along the river. Han Mingyue carefully looked at the man who seemed to be calmly listening to Han Mingyue's words. The danger under that calmness made Han Mingyue's heart tremble. At this time, Emo Xiuyao was like a bloodthirsty blade. Even the slightest touch would cause people to bleed. Finally, when Emo Xiuyao's gaze slowly moved towards Suzuki started to sob in fear. She had never realized that Emo Xiuyao could become so terrifying. Those eyes that she had once been so infatuated with were now as terrifying as a nightmare. When Emo Xiuyao stood up and walked in front of her, she could only helplessly shake her head. "Ooh, Xiuyao. Don't. Let me go, I beg you. Ooh." At this moment, Suzuki suddenly realized that killing Yili might be the biggest mistake she had made in her life. "Ooh. Don't, I didn't kill Yili. It has nothing to do with me." Chapter 371. Emo Xiuyao crouched down in front of her and looked closely at her crying face. Under that kind of gaze, Suzuki found that she couldn't even cry. After a long time she heard Emo Xiuyao ask softly, "You want to use a hidden weapon to kill Lili?" Suzuki didn't dare to answer. Emo Xiuyao clearly had no interest in her answer. He pulled open her sleeve and revealed the hidden weapon tied to her wrist. Storm pear blossom needles? He casually pulled off the box of hidden weapons on her wrist and slowly pressed it down under everyone's gaze. Ah! Suzui's scream rang through the forest. The last storm pear blossom needles in the box shot into Suzui's arm that had been holding the hidden weapon. Her originally fair and beautiful jade arm suddenly became dripping with blood, a tragic sight to behold. Shuyao. Han Mingyue couldn't bear to look away. In the end, this was the woman he had loved for more than a decade. He couldn't help but speak. You want to plead for her? Emo Shuyao looked back at him and said with a cold smile, Han Mingyue. This time, you can only choose to die with her or let her die by herself. Seeing that you were injured in order to save Li, I'll let you go. Princess Ding hasn't. Han Mingyue struggled to say something, but any words were empty and powerless in front of Emo Shuyao. Even if Li Li is standing here safe and sound, it is not a reason for her to die. But don't worry, I will not let her die so quickly. Feng-san, take her to Qin Feng. Qin Feng will know how to use her. Feng Jiao nodded silently. For the first time in his life he felt a thread of sympathy for this woman that he hated. What could Qin Feng's team, which was called Qi Lin by the prince and princess consort, do with a woman who was hated by the prince? Feng Jiao knew a little about it. Under the hands of those people, even the toughest person would cry and beg for mercy in less than 3 days. Without Prince's permission she couldn't even die even if she wanted to. Prince, Enchanting has already returned to the northwest with his gold-robed guards. This subordinate has already sent people to pursue them. At the foot of the mountain, how should we deal with the captives? Prince, please advise us. Emo Shuyao asked calmly. How many? Feng Jiao reported. Altogether there are more than 6,500 men, among which there are 7 lieutenants, 3 deputy generals and 1 general stationed in the city. It's Ryongcheng's general Qi Shaowu. Kill them all. Emo Shuyao said indifferently without the slightest hesitation. Feng Jiao stilled slightly and quickly reacted. He said in a low voice, this subordinate obeys. Yunzhou Lishan Academy before dawn, Master Qingyun, who was over 70 years old, held the hand of his youngest grandson as they strolled along the corridor. Su Hongyu's expression was calm as he accompanied his father. Father, why are you up so early? Looking at the dark sky, Su Hongyu's face showed a thread of worry and concern. Master Qingyun waved his hand and said, it's nothing. I just don't know why I woke up in the middle of the night but I can't sleep anymore. Su Hongyu thought and said, Father, are you worried about Li Er? Master Qingyun sighed and said, Father hasn't seen Li Er for many years. This child has been different from her mother since she was young. Now, these years you have suffered. Seeming to think of something, Master Qingyun looked at his son with a gaze full of love and guilt. If it wasn't for the Su family, if it wasn't for his father's reputation, how could his son only be able to stay in the academy and teach students? Other people struggled because they didn't have a good family background, but Su Hongyu was burdened by his family background. Master Qingyun knew very well that his eldest son's talent and strategy were not below his. More importantly, his eldest son even had ambitions that he didn't have. Father, what are you saying? I am also a famous scholar. How can you talk about suffering? Master Qingyun waved his hand and continued to walk forward. He said, How can I not know what you are worried about? The Su family is not blindly loyal to the imperial court and the royal family. Rather, we have no choice but to be loyal. Su Qingyan looked at his grandfather in confusion. Master Qingyun smiled and said, Qingyan, you don't understand? Su Qingyan said respectfully, Grandfather, please enlighten me. Master Qingyun sighed and said, Scholars can cause chaos in the country, but they can't overturn the power. Since ancient times, how many scholars have you seen that overturned the world? This is also why the emperors of the past always valued the civil and despised the military. Because they knew that even if there were traitors among the civil officials, it would be difficult to truly overturn the imperial power. And our Su family can't do that. Hongyu, when you agreed to the marriage between Li Er and Prince Ding, did you think about the current situation? Su Hongyu was silent for a moment. Finally he said, Father, please forgive me. I did think about it. Master Qingyun shook his head and said, I'm not saying that you did wrong. The dispute between the royal family and the Ding king's residence can't be avoided. No matter what, this generation will inevitably end, whether it's the Ding King's residence or the current emperor. It's not wrong for you to link the Su family and the Ding King's residence together. Once the Ding King's residence is destroyed, even if the royal family doesn't do anything to the Su family, the only thing waiting for the Su family is withering day by day. Although I'm old, I don't want my children and grandchildren to be as depressed as you and Hong Yan. Su Hongyu was slightly moved. He lowered his head to cover his slightly red eyes and said, "I've made you worry, father." Holding the railing of the corridor, Master Qingyun pointed to the distant sky and sighed. "The Emperor's star is dim, the army destroyer's 7 evil spirits are in the sky, and the ominous star in the northwest has appeared. The world is doomed to chaos." His father. Standing next to his father, Su Hongyu said in a deep voice. He, who was also proficient in astrology, naturally understood everything that Master Qingyun saw. Only Su Qingyan looked at the slightly brightening sky with a blank face and scratched his head. "Hongyu, remember, the Su family's family motto has never been to be loyal to a monarch." But Su Hongyu made an excuse and said, "Hongyu understands. The Su family's motto is to govern the world in chaos and save the people from fire and water. Your son doesn't dare to forget." The 10th month of this year was definitely a day that the entire world would remember. For example, Princely Mo Jingli joined forces with Nanzhao and Xiling to attack the Dechu state. For example, Prince Ding personally led the 500,000 Mahist army to meet the 3 allied forces. For example, the 16-year-old Princess Ding oversaw the northwest as a daughter. On the 15th and 16th of October, she completely annihilated the Xiling army in Hangzhou, the last line of defense in the northwest of Dechu state. At this point, the 200,000 Xiling army that confronted Princess Ding in the northwest were completely annihilated. Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling fled in panic. When this news spread, the world was shocked. For example, when Princess Ding confronted Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling, she even divided her army into 2 groups. With only 30,000 soldiers and horses, she blocked the valley that Dechu state had to pass through in the northwest. It was difficult to advance or retreat. Princess Ding's personal guard, Qin Feng, led a team of a few dozen people called Qi Lin. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Every time the Mahist army attacked or intercepted, Qi Lin would be the vanguard. He was invincible. On the 17th of October, the grain that was escorted by the Xiling reinforcements to Dechu state was burned into a pile of ashes. A huge Qilin flame rose into the sky amidst the flames. At this point, the Qilin became famous after this battle and the whole world knew about it. The 300,000 Xiling army lost all their grain and had to retreat to the border of Xiling in panic. Chapter 372. However, these were not the most important pieces of news. The most shocking news was that on the 16th of October, Princess Ding fell off a cliff in the Stopping Cloud mountain range between Hangzhou City and Riyang City in Dechu state. Her whereabouts were unknown. What was even more strange was that at that time, it was not the enemy that was guarding the foot of the mountain, but more than 7,000 Dechu state soldiers. After the incident, Prince Ding was furious. The 7,000 soldiers, including all the generals, were all executed. Not a single one was spared. It was said that the bright red blood dyed the wide river at the foot of the mountain red. Once this news came out, the world naturally discussed it. Some scolded Prince Ding for being cruel and killing the innocent. Some defended Prince Ding, saying that someone was slandering him. There were even some who secretly guessed that Princess Ding's disappearance had something to do with the 7,000 soldiers. However, no matter how the world discussed it, the Mahist army and Prince Ding, who had already re-entered Hangzhou City, did not express anything. It was as if all of this had nothing to do with them. When the news reached the Chu capital, it was the morning court session. The hall was completely silent. Everyone did not even dare to breathe loudly as they carefully waited for the emperor's decree with a twisted expression on his face. Mo Jingqi almost could not hold the booklet in his hands. It was unknown whether it was from anger or fear, but his hands were trembling non-stop. After a long time he roared, "Impudent! Mo Xiao, how dare you? He killed 7,000 soldiers without saying a word. Is he trying to rebel?" His Highness, a few old officials lowered their heads and twitched their mouths without leaving a trace. "Your Majesty, did you not see the main point? Princess Ding might be dead. With the importance Prince Ding placed on Princess Ding and Princess Ding's reputation in the Mahist army and even the entire Dechu state, do you really think that 7,000 people is a big deal? Also, even if you really think that Prince Ding wants to rebel, you don't have to say it in front of the civil and military officials. Your Majesty, Prince Ding has executed 7,000 soldiers and several generals of the imperial court without permission. This is truly treason. If we don't punish him severely, the soldiers of Dechu state and the common people will be bitterly disappointed. Would your Majesty please issue an edict to punish Prince Ding severely? Prime Minister Liu, who was currently in the limelight, stepped forward and asked. The other ministers who were Mo Jingqi's trusted aides also stepped out to support the proposal. Mo Shuyao was about to speak when someone suddenly stepped out. Your Majesty, you can't. Mo Jingqi looked up. It was indeed the old minister Su Zhe, who was over 60 years old. Mo Jingqi's expression darkened slightly, calmly asking, Elder Su, what do you think? Su Zhe bowed respectfully and said, Your Majesty, King Ding's concubine has been killed. King Ding must be extremely sad and indignant at this time. We can only appease him and not pressure him. Prime Minister Liu turned to look at Su Zhe and said mockingly, Don't tell me that the 7,000 soldiers died in vain? Elder Su, you are also a scholar. You should understand that if a prince breaks the law, he will be punished the same as a commoner. Besides, this Prince Ding is only your Majesty's subject. We naturally express our deep condolences for Princess Ding's death. Could it be that Princess Ding's life is a life and those 7,000 soldiers are weeds? These words were indeed dignified, but which one of those who could stand in the imperial court was a bookworm who only knew how to read? A prince breaking the law, he will be punished the same as a commoner? If this rule could really be fulfilled, the domineering Liu family should have been exterminated long ago. Su Zhe looked at Prime Minister Liu and sighed softly. He continued to speak to Mo Jingqi, Your Majesty, please reconsider. Now that the Dechu state is in chaos, His Highness Prince Ding acted unfairly this time. But now the Dechu state can't do without His Highness. Your Majesty, please forgive His Highness Prince Ding's mistake. Prime Minister Liu snorted, Can't do without His Highness Prince Ding? Could it be that all the civil and military officials of the Great Chu dynasty are useless? Could it be that the Great Chu dynasty can't do without Prince Ding? Su Zhe said lightly, I've heard that Lord Liu's manor has a general. But I don't know how many soldiers General Liu can lead and what achievements he has. Can he replace Prince Ding to pacify the war in the northwest? Prime Minister Liu's face turned green and white. Mo Jingqi slapped the table heavily, angrily saying, Enough. Do you think the imperial court is a place to bicker? All of you shut up. Pass down my decree. Prince Ding Mo Shuyao killed the innocent without permission. He is deceiving the emperor. Remembering the merits of our ancestors, I pardon his death. Prince Ding will be given the title of duke and his salary will be deducted for 3 years. As soon as he said this, the hall was silent. It took a long time for someone to react. Your Majesty, please reconsider. Shut up. I've made up my mind. The news from the imperial court quickly spread to the imperial harem. Empress Hua was originally receiving the worship of the concubines and the madams. When she heard the news from her trusted maid, she couldn't help but feel dizzy. Her body swayed, but she finally sat firm. She waved her hand to let the concubines and madams who didn't know what had happened leave. Then she asked in a low voice, Is this true? The maid said in a low voice, The news just came from the imperial court. I'm afraid that the emperor's decree has already left the capital. The empress weakly fell back into the phoenix chair, murmuring in a low voice, He's crazy. Princess Ding. Princess Ding. The maid said, Our family has also received the news. I'm afraid that Princess Ding's life is in danger. The empress thought of the gentle woman she had seen several times. She looked gentle and graceful but always had a feeling of intimacy and a calming aura. That woman stunned the world on the northwest battlefield, but the next moment she withered away. Sure enough, heaven was jealous of her beauty. Very quickly the empress regained her composure. Restraining the expression on her face, she said, Personally leave the palace and meet with my father. Tell him that the Hua family is of utmost importance. There is no need to worry about I. The maid hesitantly looked at the empress. The empress waved her hand and said, Go. Father will understand my intentions. The maid worriedly withdrew. Only then did the empress lean against the phoenix chair and deeply sigh. Her beautiful face was filled with worry and helplessness. Imperial Mother. Princess Changel ran into the hall with small steps. Seeing the exhausted expression on her mother's face, she worriedly asked, "Imperial Mother, what's wrong? Did something happen?" The Empress pulled Princess Changel into her embrace, gently patting her back and softly saying, "It's nothing. Nothing will happen. Good child. Imperial Mother will arrange everything for you." Although the Empress was unwilling to speak clearly, Princess Changel knew in her heart that something big must have happened. Obediently leaning into the Empress's embrace, she said, "Changel will also protect Imperial Mother. Changel wants Imperial Mother and Changel to be safe and sound together." Good child. Hangzhou City. Although it was still the governor's residence, the atmosphere was completely different. Unlike Xinyang, other than a few city gates, Hangzhou City's losses were negligible. What caused people to tremble with fear was the bloody battle that had lasted for 1 day and 1 night. By the time the reinforcements arrived at Hangzhou City, the original 30,000 Mahist army had been reduced to a little more than 10,000 soldiers. As for the 70,000 Shilling soldiers, they had been reduced to less than 30,000 soldiers. The entire city reeked of blood. With every step, the ground would be stained with dark red blood. The corpses were quickly removed and disposed of. The blood-stained streets were quickly cleaned up. Apart from the faint smell of blood that permeated the air, everything seemed to have returned to how it had been before the great battle. However, on the city gate tower within the governor's residence, there was no longer that seemingly leisurely blue-clothed woman who made people feel at ease. As for the other leader of the Mahist army, he was still in a deep sleep, unconscious. Chapter 373. In the deepest courtyard of the governor's manor, Feng Jiao was restlessly pacing back and forth in his room. Looking at Shen Yang, who was sitting by the bed taking his pulse, he asked irritably, "Mr. Shen, when will the prince wake up?" Ever since that day when he came down from the mountain, Mo Xiaoyao's body, which was not healthy to begin with, could not take the stress and fatigue of the past few days. He spat out a few mouthfuls of blood and fell off the back of the horse. From then on he did not wake up. But the people searching for the Wangfei did not dare to stop. Feng Jiao sent out tens of thousands of people every day to follow the river downstream and even upstream to search. But after 7 or 8 days there was still no news. Feng Jiao knew in his heart that there really was no hope. Xinyang turned his head to look at him and shook his head. Feng Jiao rushed forward and grabbed him. "What do you mean by shaking your head?" Xinyang said, "When the prince will wake up, it is not up to me to decide." Feng Jiao laughed dryly. "What do you mean? You're not telling me that the prince doesn't want to live anymore?" Xinyang shook his head. "That's not it. If the prince really wants to die, then he does not deserve to be Mo Liufeng's son. What I'm saying is that the prince's body does not allow him to wake up. The poison in his body has not been cleared, his body is weak and he has been sick for a long time. Now he has reached an extremely dangerous point. Once His Highness wakes up, he will definitely be enraged. There is no need for him to think of anything. His body will completely collapse." Feng Jiao did not care about his demeanor. He angrily grabbed his hair and said, "Then what should we do now? I can hold on for 2 or 3 days, 10 days to half a month. If the prince does not wake up after a long time, what will we do? What will the Mahist army do? What will the Northwest do?" Xinyang rolled his eyes and expressionlessly said, "I am a doctor. If you ask me, who will I ask? Mo Xiaoyao hasn't woken up yet?" Han Mingxi walked in with a solemn expression, glancing at the person on the bed. Feng Jiao frowned and looked at him. "Young Master Han, please conduct yourself with dignity." Han Mingxi sneered. "Conduct myself with dignity? Respect my ass. When something happened to Li Li, he just lay in bed and pretended to be dead. Get out of the way." Feng Jiao stood in front of him and said in a low voice, "Young Master Han, I respect you as a good friend of the princess consort and will give you some leeway. Don't be ungrateful." Han Mingxi was so angry that he laughed. "You still remember your princess consort? How rare. Mo Xiaoyao, if you can still breathe, then get up for me. Jun Wei is truly unlucky to have met you." Feng Jiao still wanted to speak, but he was stopped by Xinyang, who was standing to the side. Xinyang shook his head and signaled to Feng Jiao to stand to the side and not interfere. Han Mingxi snorted and walked to the side of the bed to look down at the man whose face was as white as paper. No matter how he looked at him, he was not pleasing to the eye. If it wasn't for this man, would June Wei, a young lady from a noble family, need to risk her life on the battlefield? Would she need to be forced to the point where she couldn't even properly recover after being pregnant? All of this was caused by Mo Xiaoyao's incompetence. You continue to sleep. Sleep until you die. This young master will take revenge for June Wei. Humph. Coward, idiot, trash. Feng Xiao stared dumbfoundedly at Han Mingyue, who used all the curses he knew to scold Mo Xiaoyao from the beginning to the end without any pause. Feng Xiao's expression was stiff and he didn't know how to react. Heavens above, no one had scolded the Prince of Ding Country since the establishment of the Ding Country's royal residence. It seemed that he had finally vented the anger that had been suppressed in his heart for the past few days. Han Mingxi's complexion was obviously much better. He cast a glance at Mo Xiaoyao and snorted, "If you want to play dead, then continue to play dead. This young master won't serve you anymore." After that he left like a gust of wind. Feng Xiao blinked his eyes and looked at Xin Yang with empty eyes. Xin Yang looked at the person on the bed, shook his head and turned to leave. Early in the morning, Feng Xiao was anxiously called by the guards to Mo Xiaoyao's courtyard. There was no other reason. When the guards who served the prince in the morning entered the door, they discovered that the person who was supposed to be unconscious on the bed had disappeared. Under the protection of hundreds of shadow guards and the protection of hundreds of thousands of Mahist army inside and outside the city, the prince had actually disappeared without a trace. This made everyone panic. Rushing into the courtyard, Feng Xiao couldn't care about anything else as he kicked open the half-closed door and rushed in. However, he was stunned by the scene in front of him. In the room where the prince had supposedly disappeared, the bed was still empty. But there was a thin and tall figure standing by the window in the side hall. What shocked Feng Xiao was the blinding white hair behind the figure. Prince! Prince! Coming back to his senses, Feng Xiao shouted towards the door. "Invite Mr. Shen over." Mo Xiaoyao turned his head and looked at the person in front of him. Feng Xiao felt his heart ache. The silver hair casually fell around Mo Xiaoyao's neck and made the already thin person appear even thinner and paler. But his mental state seemed to be unusually good. He did not have the situation that Xin Yang had predicted would cause his body to break down due to his rage. In Feng Xiao's view, his body seemed to be much better than before Wang Fei's accident. However, there was now a sharp glint in his eyes, which were originally warm and cold. Feng Xiao couldn't help but think of the blood-quenching knife light. It seemed that there was a terrifying beast hidden under that calmness. One day it broke out. Feng Xiao's heart trembled and he didn't dare to think further. Prince, are you all right?" The corners of Mo Xiaoyao's lips lifted slightly, but Feng Xiao couldn't feel the slightest hint of a smile. He only heard him ask coolly, "How many days have I slept?" Feng Xiao's heart trembled. 9 days. Is there any news of Li? Feng Xiao lowered his head and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei has great fortune. She will definitely turn misfortune into fortune. Then it is useless." Mo Xiao said coolly, "Great fortune? Turn misfortune into fortune? I do not believe in ghosts or gods and do not pray to the heavens. If she dies, I will turn this world into a purgatory and use the mountains and rivers as a sacrifice for her." Feng Xiao's heart shook and he shook his head in defeat. If Mo Xiao was mad, depressed or grieving, what could he say to comfort him? But facing the man who calmly said such shocking words, he could not say anything. He did not know what to say, or rather he did not dare. The room was silent. After a long time, Mo Xiaoyao said, "Tell I about Li Li." Feng Xiao didn't know what to say, but he had no choice but to say it. Thus he recounted everything that had happened since Mo Xiaoyao left. He recalled everything that had happened in detail. When he could not avoid mentioning the child that was almost 2 months old, Feng Xiao silently glanced at the silver-haired man by the window. Other than seeing his hand tightly gripping the window frame in front of him, there was not a ripple on his calm face. Xin Yang hurriedly came in with a medicine box. Feng Xiao immediately closed his mouth and moved to the side of the door. Xin Yang stood at the door and stilled when he saw the person by the window. It was clear that the situation in front of him was not within his expectations. It was not that a person's hair turned white overnight had not been recorded before, but to see it with his own eyes was another matter. On the other hand, Xin Yang somewhat understood why Mo Xiaoyao could stand on his own after waking up so quickly, and not lie in bed with an even weaker body. The anger, resentment, pain, and grief in his heart did not leave even when he was unconscious, which was why his hair turned white. But in the end it was released. As long as Prince Ding did not overindulge his temper and emotions, he was temporarily safe. As long as there was time, he would find a way to completely cure him. Thinking of this, Xinyang let out a sigh of relief. He walked forward and said in a low voice, "Prince, please allow this one to take your pulse." Chapter 374. Emo Shuyao did not object. He casually sat down on a chair by the window and placed his wrist on the table. Xinyang stepped forward to check his pulse. He looked at Emo Shuyao with some confusion and frowned. "Prince's body is fine for now. However, I ask that Prince not be too tired. Take care." "Thank you for your trouble, Mr. Shin." Emo Shuyao nodded. This time Xinyang also noticed that something was wrong with Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao was not a patient that was hard to take care of, but he was definitely not a patient that would listen to a doctor's advice. Seeing how seriously Emo Shuyao was listening to his advice for some reason, made him feel uneasy. "These days, Prince, I'm afraid his mental state has been hurt. This one will prescribe some medicine. Prince, take it as a hint." "I understand." Emo Shuyao nodded. He thought for a moment and lifted the white hair on his shoulder to take a look. "I ask Mr. Shin to help me prepare some medicine to cover up my white hair." Xinyang paused and nodded. This subordinate obeys. Reporting to Prince, an envoy from the capital. The guard outside the door reported. Emo Shuyao lowered his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "Let him in." This one, Assistant Minister Lu Tsongyun, greets Your Highness Prince Ding. This time the envoy who came to deliver the decree was clearly different from the previous unlucky official. At least just from the extravagance it was clear that the two were completely different. An assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments from the Lu clan was accompanied by several generals. Not to mention the 3,000 elite soldiers and a few hundred guards who were blocked outside the city. Feng Jiao, who was standing to the side, tugged at the corners of his lips. A mocking smile flashed in his eyes. What did Emo Jingqi mean by this? On the seat, Emo Shuyao's face was still somewhat pale. However, it was impossible to tell that he was still lying unconscious on the bed. His white hair also returned to its original black color with the potion provided by Shenyang. Coupled with the faint smile on his handsome face, Emo Shuyao really didn't look like a man whose beloved wife had just fallen off a cliff and disappeared. Lu Tsongyun looked at Prince Ding, who was seated, and frowned slightly. She felt a little uneasy because of Prince Ding's unexpected behavior. Therefore, even though he came with the order to reprimand Emo Shuyao, he still respectfully went up to greet him. "Lord Lu, please don't stand on ceremony." Emo Shuyao smiled calmly and pointed to the seat beside him. "Lord Lu, please sit." Lu Tsongyun looked somewhat cautiously at Emo Shuyao. She couldn't see any emotion in his calm and deep eyes. She could only stand and thank him. She sat down beside Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao glanced at Feng Jiao. Feng Jiao smiled and sat down opposite Lu Tsongyun. Not long after, the generals stationed in Hangzhou City also arrived and sat down. Lu Tsongyun looked at the situation in front of her and her smile stiffened. Emo Shuyao leisurely put down his teacup and smiled at Lu Tsongyun. "Lord Lu, I haven't been feeling well recently and couldn't personally welcome the saint at the city gates. Please forgive me." Seeing Emo Shuyao smile so amiably, Lu Tsongyun felt her hair stand on end. She hurriedly smiled and said, "Prince is joking. The princess consort's matter. The princess consort is a unique woman. Heaven helps the worthy. Prince, please do not worry." Emo Shuyao stilled slightly and then quickly smiled. He nodded and said, "Lord Lu is right. I's Princess Li is truly a unique woman." Feng Jiao also had a relaxed smile as he praised Princess Consort for her virtue, talent and beauty, and how she had led the Mahist army to defeat the Xiling army. Lu Tsongyun could only smile and praise Yi Li's merits. For a moment she didn't know how to speak. Fortunately, Emo Shuyao did not sit here to have people praise his princess consort. Before Lu Tsongyun could continue, he calmly changed the topic. "I remember that Lord Lu is the grandson of Prime Minister Lu. Will Prime Minister Lu come in?" Lu Tsongyun replied cautiously, "Grandfather is healthy and often misses Prince's hard work on the campaign." Emo Shuyao smiled faintly and said, "I also learned much from Prime Minister Lu when I was young. I is also very gratified that the old prime minister is healthy. Right, for the emperor to send Lord Lu, the future patriarch of the Lu family, there must be an important matter. I hope that I do not have a personal matter with Lord Lu? Lu Tsongyun didn't dare to say it. He felt a slight bitterness in his mouth. At this moment the atmosphere was so good that he didn't know how to take out the emperor's decree. If Emo Shuyao hadn't taken the initiative to ask, he might not have found a chance to announce it until the end. Of course he could have just announced the decree as soon as he arrived, but Lu Tsongyun was the eldest grandson of the Lu family. He had been raised as the future head of the family since he was young. He was not someone ordinary people could compare to. Lu Tsongyun didn't believe that there was nothing fishy about Wang Jingchuan's death. He also understood Wang Jingchuan's personality and conduct. Thus he was even more careful about this task that he didn't want to do. He didn't dare to show any arrogance in front of Prince Ding. Standing up, Lu Tsongyun raised his hands in salute to Emo Shuyao and said, "This official has indeed brought the emperor's decree. Would your highness Prince Ding please accept the decree?" Emo Shuyao smiled in response, but he didn't show any intention of moving from his chair. Not to mention getting up to greet him, he didn't even have the intention to sit up straight to show his respect. It wasn't just Emo Shuyao. Even the generals sitting below didn't show any intention of moving. Lu Tsongyun's lips twitched. He pretended not to see anything. He had come to announce the decree, not to protect the emperor's dignity. As long as he could return to the capital alive, he could complain to the emperor however he wanted. However, the prerequisite was that he could return alive after reading the decree. Lu Tsongyun turned his head and took the bright yellow cloth from the box from the attendant beside him. He unfolded it and read in a clear voice, "By the will of the heavens the emperor decrees. Prince Ding Emo Shuyao has willfully murdered the innocent. He has deceived the emperor. Jin remembers the merits of our ancestors and pardons his death sentence. Prince Ding will be conferred the title of Junwang, and his salary will be forfeited for 3 years." The hall was completely silent. Lu Tsongyun could clearly feel the unfriendly gazes of the people around him. He also felt the faint traces of sweat in his hands as he held the decree. Doing his best to appear calm and composed, Lu Tsongyun closed the bright yellow cloth and walked forward. "Prince Ding, please accept the decree." Emo Shuyao gently waved his sleeve and the bright yellow decree landed in his hand. Emo Shuyao opened it and looked at the familiar handwriting on it. His handsome eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to be deep in thought for a long time. The smile on his lips became more obvious and made people feel even colder. Feng Jiao, who was sitting closest to him, squeezed himself deeper into his chair. The other generals all looked down and pretended not to see anything. Demoted to Junwang, forfeited for 3 years? Emo Shuyao's voice quietly sounded in the hall. There seemed to be a strange smile in his voice. Is this what the emperor wants to say? Lu Tsongyun's heart broke out in cold sweat. He respectfully said, reporting to Prince Ding, "The emperor doesn't have any other intentions. It's just that the emperor has to give the people of the world an explanation for this matter."